Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a medieval village just as the sun touches the western horizon, painting timber-framed cottages in shades of amber and rose. You're standing in the muddy main street, watching shadows lengthen across thatched roofs, and you can feel the entire community shifting its rhythm. The day's frantic energy, the hammering of the blacksmith, the calls of merchants. The bleating of sheep begins to drain away like water through a sieve. In its place comes something softer, slower, more mysterious. This is the quiet hour after sunset, a time that shaped medieval life in ways you've probably never imagined. The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for, like why our ancestors went to bed so impossibly early, or what people actually did in the darkness before electric lights turned night into an extended day. So, before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or maybe leave a comment below, but make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. Tell me where you're watching from tonight. Or maybe share your own memory of experiencing true darkness without city lights. Now, let's keep the lights as soft as possible. Turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You notice the light changing with a speed that feels almost aggressive compared to modern sunsets. Without street lamps to soften the transition, the medieval twilight rushes toward you like a tide. The sun disappears behind the Lord's manor on the hill, and within minutes, not the gradual hour you're used to, the village begins to vanish into blue-grey dimness. You can still make out shapes: the well in the village square, the outline of the church tower, the hunched form of your neighbour carrying a final bucket of water from the stream. But details are already blurring, edges softening into shadow. Your hands are still dirty from the day's work. If you're a peasant farmer, and statistically, you almost certainly are, you've spent the hours since dawn bent over in the fields. Your back aches with a deep, bone-level soreness that no amount of rest ever quite erases. The medieval workday didn't follow our neat 9-to-5 schedule. It followed the sun, which meant summer days stretched brutally long while winter days offered a strange, compressed mercy of shorter labour. Now, as autumn approaches, you're somewhere in between, and your body knows it's time to retreat indoors, not because a clock tells you so, but because your eyes are starting to struggle with the dimness. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants were more or less exhausted than modern workers, but there's no debate about this. Physical labour was simply the default state of existence. Even children worked from the moment they could walk. Even the elderly contributed what they could until their bodies simply gave out. So this quiet hour after sunset isn't just about darkness, it's about exhaustion, about bodies desperate for rest, about a community collectively releasing the day's burdens. You hear the laughter of children still playing in the village square, their games taking on a frantic quality as they squeeze out the last possible moments of outdoor freedom. A group of boys kicks a leather ball stuffed with rags, their shouts echoing off cottage walls. Two girls play a clapping game whose rhythm sounds almost identical to ones you might have played yourself centuries later. Some things transcend time, and children's resistance to bedtime is apparently one of them. But their mothers are already calling from doorways, voices carrying that universal tone of parental warning. Inside now, before the light fails completely, you can hear the anxiety beneath the command. Darkness in the medieval world wasn't just an inconvenience, it was genuinely dangerous. Without streetlights, a simple stumble could mean a broken bone. Without modern medicine, a broken bone could mean death. Plus, there's the deeper fear, the one nobody likes to say out loud in daylight, the genuine belief that the dark hours belong to something other than humans. You turn toward your own cottage, A single-room structure whose walls are made of wattle and daub woven sticks plastered with a mixture of mud, straw, and let's be honest, animal dung. The smell is something you stopped noticing years ago. The same way modern people stop smelling their own homes. Your thatched roof needs repair. You can see gaps where rain will definitely find its way through come winter. But that's a problem for tomorrow. Right now, you're focused on getting inside, getting the door secured, and beginning the evening rituals that will carry you safely into sleep. The air temperature's already dropping. Without the sun's warmth, autumn evenings in medieval England or France, or Germany, or anywhere across Europe turn cold with shocking speed. You're wearing the same rough woolen tunic you've worn for weeks, possibly months. Washing clothes is an enormous labour, so most people simply don't. Very often, you smell of sweat and smoke and earth, but so does everyone else. So it barely registers. Medieval noses were calibrated to a completely different baseline of normal. You pause at your doorway and look back at the village one more time. The church rises dark against the dimming sky. Its stone bulk somehow both comforting and ominous. You can see candlelight beginning to flicker in a few cottage windows, the wealthy families, the ones who can afford to burn expensive tallow candles or even beeswax if they're truly prosperous. Most homes, including yours, will make do with a hearth fire and perhaps a rushlight, a dried reed soaked in animal fat that burns with a smoky, sputtering flame. A dog barks somewhere in the distance. Then another answers. Then another, until a whole chorus of canine voices rises and falls. Medieval villages were full of dogs, working animals, who earned their keep by guarding flocks and warning of strangers. They're starting their own shift now. The night watch of the animal world. Their barking will continue intermittently through the dark hours. A soundtrack so constant that you've learned to sleep through it, waking only when the pattern changes in a way that signals actual danger. The quiet hour is settling over everything like a blanket being drawn up. You can feel it in your bones, this shift from public life to private life, from community to family, from labour to rest. Modern people talk about work-life balance as if it's something to be achieved through careful scheduling. But medieval peasants had no such concept. Life was work. Work was life. And this hour after sunset was simply the hinge point where one type of survival gave way to another. You can see your neighbour, old Thomas, limping toward his cottage 3 doors down. His gait is uneven, a farming accident years ago that healed badly, leaving him with a permanent reminder of how fragile medieval life could be. He nods at you in that wordless acknowledgement village people share, a gesture that says, "I see you, we survived another day together." There's comfort in that. The medieval village was claustrophobic by modern standards. Everyone knew everyone's business. Privacy was essentially non-existent, but it also meant you were never truly alone. Your struggles were witnessed. Your survival was a collective achievement. The sky is deepening now from blue to indigo, and the first stars are beginning to pierce through. You can see Venus hanging bright above the western horizon, though you probably call it the evening star rather than knowing its planetary name. Medieval astronomy was a strange mix of practical observation and complete misunderstanding. Farmers could predict weather with impressive accuracy by reading cloud patterns and animal behaviour, yet they believed the stars were literally holes in the celestial sphere through which divine light shone. Science and superstition weren't separate categories yet. They were just different ways of trying to understand a world that remained deeply mysterious. Inside your cottage, you know your wife is already preparing the evening meal, if meal is even the right word for the bread and pottage that constitutes most of your diet. The hearth fire is the centre of everything, providing light, warmth, and the means to cook. It's never fully extinguished, because starting a fire from scratch with flint and steel is difficult and time-consuming. Instead, fires are banked carefully each night, buried under ash to keep coals smouldering until morning, when they can be coaxed back to flame. Some families maintained the same fire for years, decades even, a continuous thread of warmth passed from one generation to the next. Here's a quirky detail that rarely makes it into history books. Many medieval families assigned someone, usually a child, the specific job of fire watcher during the quiet hour. This person's task was to make absolutely certain no sparks escaped the hearth, because a single errant ember could turn an entire village into an inferno. Thatch roofs were basically kindling, waiting for an excuse to ignite. Village fires were so common that most settlements burned down and were rebuilt multiple times across the medieval period. So while the quiet hour feels peaceful on the surface, there's an underlying current of vigilance, of watching, of staying alert even as exhaustion pulls at your eyelids. The church bell rings out across the village, its bronze voice cutting through the gathering dusk with a clarity that makes you pause mid-step. This isn't the cheerful peal that calls villagers to Sunday Mass, nor the frantic clanging that signals fire or invasion. This is the curfew bell, and its slow, measured tolling carries a message that every soul in the village understands without needing to translate. The day is over. The night is beginning, and you need to be inside. Now. The word curfew itself comes from the French couvre-feu, meaning cover fire, and it's a literal instruction as much as a metaphorical one. Cover your fires, close your doors, retreat into your private world before the darkness claims the public spaces completely. You quicken your pace toward your cottage, not quite running but moving with purpose. The curfew bell creates a palpable shift in the village atmosphere. People who are dawdling suddenly hurry. Conversations cut short mid-sentence. The village square, which moments ago held a handful of lingering souls, empties like water down a drain. It's fascinating how a single sound can have such power, how centuries of conditioning have trained every person to respond with almost Pavlovian immediacy. Modern people might find it oppressive, this enforced retreat, but you've never known anything different. The bell is just part of the natural rhythm, as inevitable as sunrise and nearly as welcome after a long day of labour. At the village gates, wooden structures reinforced with iron and set into the earthen embankments that surround the settlement, you can see the bailiff and his assistant beginning the closing ritual. These gates aren't symbolic, they're genuinely defensive, though what they're defending against is a matter of some debate. Bandits, certainly. Wild animals, occasionally. Wolves still roamed the forests of medieval Europe. And while they rarely attacked humans, the fear of them was very real. But there's also the sense that the gates protect against something less tangible, something the village elders won't quite name aloud: the dark itself. And whatever walks in it, the bailiff is a thick-shouldered man named Robert, and you can hear him grunting with effort as he and his assistant push the heavy wooden gates closed. The hinges shriek in protest. Someone keeps meaning to grease them with animal fat. But it never quite happens, and then the massive crossbeam drops into place with a thud that reverberates through the ground beneath your feet. That sound marks a definitive separation inside the village walls. You're part of the protected community. Outside them, you're on your own in a landscape that grows more threatening with every passing minute of darkness. Historians still argue whether medieval villages were as isolated and paranoid as folklore suggests. or whether the gates were more about tax collection and controlling movement than genuine security concerns. The truth probably falls somewhere in between. Yes, the roads were dangerous. Yes, travellers were viewed with suspicion. Yes, being caught outside after curfew could result in fines or worse. But villages also needed contact with the outside world. They couldn't survive without trade, without news, without the circulation of goods and people and ideas. So the gates represented both protection and prison, safety and constraint, a physical manifestation of the medieval tension between community and freedom. You slip inside your cottage just as full darkness settles over the village like a heavy cloak. Behind you, you hear the gates of the village being secured with chains, an additional measure that speaks to how seriously the community takes nighttime security. Some villages even employed gatekeepers who slept in small chambers built into the wall itself, ready to raise the alarm if anything suspicious approached. In larger towns, the gates wouldn't open again until dawn, no matter who came knocking. Medical emergency. Too bad. Woman in labour needing the midwife from the next village. She'll have to manage. The rules of curfew were absolute, and exceptions were rare enough to become the stuff of local legend. Inside the cottage, your eyes struggle to adjust to the dimness. The hearth fire provides the only light, casting dancing shadows across the walls and making familiar objects look strange and slightly menacing. Your wife looks up from where she's stirring the pot hanging over the flames, her face illuminated from below in a way that makes her look older than her 28 years, though 28 is actually approaching elderly by medieval standards. Where life expectancy hovered somewhere in the 30s if you were lucky enough to survive childhood. You barely made it, she says, and there's no accusation in her voice, just statement of fact. Being caught outside after curfew could mean a fine the family couldn't afford, or a night in the stocks if the bailiff was feeling particularly strict. The curfew laws were taken seriously because fire safety was taken seriously. In towns and cities, night watchmen patrolled specifically to check that no one had left candles burning unattended, that hearth fires were properly banked, that no one was engaging in activities that might lead to the one disaster medieval communities feared above almost all others: uncontrolled fire spreading from building to building until entire neighbourhoods became infernos. Here's something that rarely gets mentioned in romantic tales of medieval life. The curfew bell probably saved thousands of lives over the centuries, not from bandits or wolves, but from fire itself. By enforcing a specific time when everyone had to be indoors and settled, it created a natural checkpoint for fire safety. Families had to actively think about their hearth, their candles, their lamps. They couldn't just wander off to bed leaving flames unattended. The curfew wasn't just about social control, though it was definitely also about social control. It was about practical survival in a world where a single spark could destroy everything you owned. You can hear the village settling around you, a symphony of small sounds filtering through the thin walls. Doors closing with creaks and thuds, mothers calling final instructions to children, the clatter of wooden bowls being set out for the evening meal, someone's baby crying with that particular intensity that suggests teething or colic. A married couple arguing in low, intense voices that don't quite mask their words, something about money. Always about money, because poverty was the constant background hum of medieval peasant life. The gates closing creates a psychological shift that's difficult to explain to modern people who can leave their homes anytime they choose. You're sealed in now, committed to the night ahead, with no option for a late-night walk or a quick run to the store or any of the thousand small freedoms that define contemporary existence. Some historians suggest this enforced containment contributed to the intense claustrophobia of medieval village life, the way everyone knew everyone else's business, the way gossip could destroy reputations and feuds could simmer for generations. When you can't escape, you have to find ways to coexist, and those ways weren't always pleasant. But there's also something comforting about the gates closing if you're honest with yourself. The decision has been made for you. You're done with the day. Whatever you didn't accomplish will have to wait until tomorrow. The darkness outside those wooden walls is someone else's problem now specifically. It's the night watchman's problem, and you're glad it's not you walking the perimeter with nothing but a lantern and a stick for protection. Your youngest child, a boy of 5, presses against your leg, and you can feel him trembling slightly. "Papa, are the gates strong enough?" he asks. And you know he's not really asking about the physical strength of wood and iron. He's asking the deeper question, are we safe? Will the darkness stay outside where it belongs? Will morning come again? These are the questions that haunt medieval children, who grow up in a world where the night is genuinely frightening, where monsters aren't just stories, but things their parents half believe might actually exist in the forests beyond the fields. The gates are strong enough, you tell him, and you believe it. Mostly, the village has stood here for longer than anyone can remember, surviving plague and famine and the occasional raid by soldiers from whatever war the nobles are currently fighting. The gates have held, the walls have held, the community has held. And tomorrow, when the sun rises and the curfew bell rings again, this time signalling the all clear, those gates will swing open and life will resume. But that's tomorrow. Right now, in this quiet hour after sunset, with the gates closed and the darkness gathering, you're in that liminal space between day and night, between labour and rest, between the public world and the private one. The first thing you do after securing the door, a flimsy wooden affair that wouldn't stop a determined intruder but at least keeps out the wind, is begin the ritual of extinguishing fires. This seems counterintuitive at first, doesn't it? The sun has just set, darkness is falling, and yet here you are deliberately reducing the amount of light in your home. But fire in the medieval world isn't the convenient, controlled thing you flip on with a switch. It's dangerous, expensive, and demanding of constant attention. Every flame that burns consumes resources your family can barely afford, and every flame that burns unsupervised is a potential disaster waiting to happen. Your wife has already snuffed out the rushlight that was burning near the doorway, a poor quality light source that consisted of a dried rush reed dipped in animal fat, held in a simple metal clip. It burned for maybe an hour at most, producing more smoke than illumination, filling the cottage with a greasy smell that clung to everything. Rushlights were the economy option for medieval families, cheaper than candles but also vastly inferior. The wealthy might burn beeswax candles that smelled sweet and produced a steady, clean light. The moderately prosperous used tallow candles made from rendered animal fat. But your family uses rushlights when you use anything at all, and even those feel like an extravagance. You move toward the single tallow candle burning on the rough wooden table, a genuine luxury that your wife lit only because tonight is Friday and old habit dies hard, even for peasants who can barely afford such gestures toward piety. The candle flame dances in the draught that seems to find its way through every crack in the cottage walls, casting wild shadows that make the room feel alive with movement. You lick your fingers the medieval version of a candle snuffer and pinch the wick, feeling the brief sting of heat before the flame dies with a small hiss and a wisp of smoke that smells of sheep fat and burnt hair. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants were more fire-conscious than modern people, or whether the constant threat of conflagration was simply accepted as an unavoidable risk of existence. The evidence suggests both things were true simultaneously. people were terrified of fire they'd seen entire villages burn. New families who'd lost everything to a single spark, yet they also lived in such close proximity to open flames that a certain fatalism developed. You couldn't function in a medieval household without fire, so you learned to respect it, manage it, and pray that tonight wouldn't be the night your luck ran out. The hearth fire is different from the candles and rushlights. This fire stays lit, always, but it needs to be carefully managed for the night ahead. Your wife is already at work, using a long iron poker to spread out the burning logs, breaking them into smaller pieces that will burn down to coals rather than maintaining large flames. The goal is to create a bed of embers that will radiate heat through the night without shooting sparks or producing too much light. Medieval people actually slept better in near total darkness. Their circadian rhythms were aligned with natural day-night cycles in a way that modern humans, with our artificial lighting and screens, can barely comprehend. You watch as she carefully banks the coals, using the poker to push them toward the back of the hearth, then covering them with a layer of ash. This ash acts as insulation, keeping the coals alive but contained, reducing them to a dull glow that's barely visible. It's a delicate operation that she's performed thousands of times, yet it still requires concentration. Too much ash and the fire will suffocate completely, meaning you'll have to restart it from scratch in the morning using the tedious process of striking sparks with flint and steel. Too little ash and the coals might flare back up during the night, potentially sending sparks onto the straw-covered floor. Here's a detail that sounds almost absurd to modern ears. Some medieval households employed what were essentially human fire extinguishers family members whose primary job during sleeping hours was to remain semi-alert, watching for any sign that sparks had escaped the hearth. Often, this duty fell to elderly grandparents who slept lightly anyway, or to adolescents who were considered old enough to handle the responsibility but not yet important enough to require a full night's rest. They'd doze, sitting up near the hearth, jerking awake at any unusual sound or smell, ready to smother flames with a leather blanket kept nearby specifically for that purpose. Your own cottage doesn't have such a dedicated fire watcher. Your family is too small and too poor for that luxury, but you've positioned the sleeping pallet strategically so that you're between the hearth and the door. If something goes wrong during the night, you'll wake first, giving you precious seconds to respond before disaster spreads. It's not much of a plan, but it's what you have. And somehow your family has survived year after year without catastrophe. Other families in the village haven't been so lucky. Just last spring, the miller's cottage caught fire in the night, and though everyone escaped alive, they lost everything they owned and spent the summer rebuilding from scratch. The room is noticeably darker now with the candle extinguished and the hearth fire banked. Your eyes are adjusting, finding the shapes of familiar objects in the dimness, the table, the water bucket, the chest where you keep your few spare clothes and your wife's dowry, items, a wooden comb, a decent wool cloak, a pewter spoon that belonged to her mother. The darkness feels thick, almost tangible, pressing against the walls of the cottage like something with weight and substance. Your children are already settling onto their sleeping pallet, a cloth sack stuffed with straw that will need to be refilled soon because it's compressed into uncomfortable lumps. They squirm and jostle for position, the older ones claiming the better spots while the youngest gets stuck near the drafty edge. You can hear them whispering to each other, that particular rapid-fire chatter children produce when they're overtired but fighting sleep. Your wife makes a shushing sound, not unkind, and the whispers subside into giggles, then into silence. You perform one final check of the cottage before settling in yourself. You test the door to make sure it's properly secured, the wooden bar slots firmly across it, resting in iron brackets on either side. The shutters on the single window are already closed and latched. The shutters are crude, made of rough planks that don't quite fit together, leaving gaps where wind and rain can penetrate. Glass windows are for churches and manor houses, not for peasant cottages. Most of your neighbours don't even have shutters. They simply stuff their window openings with straw or rags during cold weather and leave them open during summer. The banked fire glows softly in the hearth, barely visible but radiating enough warmth to take the edge off the evening chill. In winter, this cottage will be bitterly cold despite the fire, cold enough that you'll see your breath indoors, cold enough that water left in buckets will freeze overnight. But this is autumn, and the temperature is merely cool rather than brutal. You can hear the wind picking up outside, rustling through the thatched roof, finding its way through every crack and crevice in the walls. The cottage breathes with the wind, almost alive, settling and creaking like an old person easing into a chair. Here's something that medieval people understood instinctively, but modern people have forgotten: darkness has texture. It's not simply the absence of light, but a presence in itself. Something you can feel against your skin, something that changes the way sounds travel and the way air moves. In the banked dimness of your cottage, with just the faint glow of buried coals, you're experiencing a quality of darkness that electric lights have made virtually extinct. Your pupils are dilated as wide as they'll go, drinking in every photon, turning your night vision into something surprisingly effective once you give it time to adjust. You can still make out shapes and movement in this darkness, not details, but enough to navigate, enough to know where your family members are, enough to spot trouble if it arrives. Your ancestors lived like this for thousands of generations, their eyes evolving to function in exactly these conditions, their nervous systems calibrated to this level of ambient light. Modern humans flood their environments with illumination and then wonder why they can't sleep, why they feel disconnected from natural rhythms, why anxiety seems to spike as soon as the sun goes down. Your medieval body doesn't have those problems. When it's dark, you sleep. When it's light, you wake. The system is simple, brutal, and remarkably effective. Just as you're about to settle onto your own sleeping pallet, you hear the familiar shuffle and cluck that signals the evening migration you've been anticipating with resignation. Your chickens are coming inside for the night, and they're bringing all their noise, their mess, and their distinctive smell with them. The small door you cut into the base of the cottage wall, barely large enough for a bird to squeeze through, creaks open as the first hen pokes her head inside, her beady eyes reflecting the dim glow of the banked fire. Behind her, 3 more hens crowd through, followed by the rooster who acts like he's personally escorting them to safety, rather than just following along because he has no other choice. This nightly ritual of bringing livestock indoors strikes modern people as bizarre, unhygienic, even disgusting. And yes, it's all of these things by contemporary standards. But in the medieval village, the practice made perfect economic and practical sense. Chickens represented significant wealth. Each bird was worth perhaps a week's wages, and the eggs they produced were crucial protein for a diet otherwise dominated by bread and pottage. Leaving them outside overnight meant risking them to foxes, weasels, martins, and a whole catalogue of predators that considered chickens the medieval equivalent of fast food, convenient, tasty, and poorly defended. The chickens immediately begin their evening routine, which involves an impressive amount of fuss for creatures with brains the size of walnuts. They strut around the cottage floor, pecking at invisible specks, clucking commentary to each other, in what sounds like complaints about the accommodations. The rooster, a scrawny red bird with an attitude far exceeding his actual fighting ability, makes a circuit of the room as though inspecting it for threats, then settles onto his preferred roosting spot, the wooden beam that runs across the cottage about 5 feet off the ground, installed specifically for this purpose. Your goat is next. She's a brown and white dairy goat named Well. You don't actually name her because naming livestock you might eventually have to eat feels like a dangerous emotional investment. But your children call her Brownie with the unself-conscious affection children have for animals, and you haven't stopped them because the goat does, admittedly, respond to the name. She pushes through the doorway, the human doorway this time. Since she's far too large for the chicken entrance, her hooves clattering on the hard-packed earth floor, her bell tinkling with each movement. The goat heads immediately for the corner where you've spread a thin layer of straw. Her designated sleeping area. She circles 3 times. Why do animals always circle before lying down, then drops heavily onto her side with a satisfied grunt? The goat is arguably more valuable than the chickens combined. She produces milk daily, enough for your family with occasionally a little surplus to trade. Her milk becomes cheese, which keeps through winter when fresh food becomes scarce. Eventually, when she's too old to produce milk anymore, she'll become meat and her hide will become leather. Nothing is wasted in the medieval economy. Everything has multiple uses, multiple values, multiple purposes. Historians still argue whether housing animals indoors with humans was a universal medieval practice, or whether it varied significantly by region, climate, and economic status. The evidence suggests widespread adoption across much of northern Europe, where cold winters made outdoor animal housing impractical, and where the shared body heat of livestock actually helped keep cottages warmer. In southern regions with milder climates, animals were more likely to have separate shelters. But here, in your village, in what will eventually be called England, bringing the animals inside is simply what everyone does, and the idea of leaving them outside in the cold would seem cruel and wasteful. The pig is the last to enter, and he's the most problematic of your indoor barnyard. He's a half-grown shote, maybe 6 months old, being fattened for slaughter sometime before Christmas. Pigs in the medieval period look nothing like the pink, plump, domestic hogs of modern farms. Your pig is lean, long-legged, bristly, and mean-tempered, more closely resembling a small wild boar than anything you'd recognize from a children's farm book. He has sharp tusks already starting to emerge, a ridge of stiff hair along his spine, and a personality that can only be described as aggressively antisocial. The pig doesn't want to come inside. He never wants to come inside, every single night. This becomes a battle of wills between you and an animal that outweighs you and has far fewer scruples about using violence to make a point. You can hear your wife already sighing from her position near the hearth, knowing what's coming. Your oldest son, a boy of 10 who's probably helped with this operation 500 times, moves to block the door while you grab the stick you keep specifically for pig herding purposes. The pig sees you coming and makes his intentions clear with a low, rumbling growl that sounds disturbingly aggressive for a creature you technically own. He backs up, his small eyes watching you with what looks like calculation. You know from painful experience that the pig will either bolt for freedom, squeezing past you with surprising speed and forcing a humiliating chase through the darkening village, or he'll charge directly at you in an attempt to intimidate you into backing down. It's a 50-50 chance which strategy he'll employ, and you're not looking forward to either option. "Just get in here, you miserable beast," you mutter, using the stick to prod him gently toward the doorway. The pig responds by letting out a squeal so loud and so piercing that it momentarily drowns out every other sound in the cottage. Your children giggle, they always find the pig's tantrums entertaining while your wife makes a disgusted sound. The pig continues squealing, a noise designed by evolution to alert every predator within a mile radius that prey is available, which seems counterproductive but apparently works for pigs. Here's a quirky detail about medieval pig keeping that rarely makes it into the history books. Pigs were considered semi-public property in many villages. They were allowed to roam freely during the day, feeding themselves by rooting through the forest for acorns and other mast, essentially foraging at no cost to their owners. A village swineherd would manage the whole community's pigs as a collective herd, driving them out to the woods each morning and bringing them back each evening. This system worked surprisingly well, though it required some method of identifying which pig belonged to whom, usually involving notches cut into ears or marks branded into hides. Your pig finally, reluctantly, lurches through the doorway, still making occasional grunts of protest. You quickly bar the door behind him before he can reconsider and attempt an escape. The pig immediately heads for the spot farthest from the hearth. Fire pigs run hot and don't appreciate excess warmth, where he flops down with a final theatrical sigh that seems designed to communicate his deep dissatisfaction with the entire arrangement. The cottage is now officially full. 2 adults, 4 children, 1 goat, 4 chickens, 1 rooster, and 1 deeply resentful pig, all sharing approximately 200 square feet of living space. The smell is distinctive, a mixture of human sweat, animal dung, smoke from the banked fire, old cooking odours, damp wool, and the earthy smell of the straw scattered across the floor. Your nose adapted to this particular bouquet years ago, the same way your ears adapted to the constant background noise of the animals shifting, breathing, and occasionally making their opinions known. The animal's presence changes the cottage atmosphere in ways both obvious and subtle. The temperature rises noticeably, all those bodies producing heat, warming the air that will keep everyone from freezing as the night deepens. The sounds multiply: the soft clucking of drowsy chickens, the goat's rhythmic breathing, the pig's occasional snorts and grunts, all layering over the human sounds of your family settling in for sleep. Even the quality of darkness changes, becoming somehow less absolute with the animal's larger forms, creating new shadows and shapes in the dim firelight. Your youngest daughter, barely 3 years old, has already fallen asleep on the pallet, her thumb in her mouth, completely unbothered by the menagerie surrounding her. She's never known any other way of living. To her, sleeping 10 feet from a pig is perfectly normal, no stranger than sleeping next to her siblings or her parents. This is just how homes are, how families are, how the world is arranged. The separation of human and animal living spaces is a luxury that won't become standard for her social class for another several centuries. The goat chooses this moment to sneeze a surprisingly loud, wet sound, spraying mucus across the floor. Nobody reacts. This is also perfectly normal. The chickens have already started producing their nightly deposits, white splashes of droppings that will need to be swept out tomorrow along with all the other accumulated mess. The pig, you're certain, will urinate at some point during the night, adding his contribution to the general squalor. Medieval cottage floors were essentially composting systems, accumulating layers of straw, animal waste, dropped food, and general debris that would be cleaned out maybe once or twice a year and spread on the fields as fertilizer. You settle onto your own section of the sleeping pallet, feeling the straw compress beneath your weight, already knowing which lumps will dig into your back and which positions will minimize the discomfort. Your wife curls up beside you, her back against your chest, sharing warmth. The children are arranged like cordwood on the other pallet, the older ones automatically wrapping around the younger ones in unconscious protection. The animals have all found their spots and mostly settled, though the rooster occasionally shifts position on his beam, his claws scratching against the wood. You lie there in the growing darkness, listening to the sounds of the village settling around you, and your mind turns to the one place that's probably still buzzing with activity, the alehouse run by Agnes the alewife. You can picture it clearly even from here, a cottage barely larger than your own, distinguished mainly by the ale stake thrust out above the door. A long pole with a bundle of straw tied to the end signalling that fresh ale is available. Every village has at least one alewife, usually several, because ale isn't just a beverage in the medieval world, it's safer than water, more nutritious than you'd expect, and one of the few pleasures available to people whose lives are otherwise defined by unrelenting labour. Agnes is a widow in her 40s, which makes her ancient by village standards, though she's still strong enough to haul the heavy brewing equipment and manage the physical demands of her trade. Brewing ale is women's work, always has been, considered a natural extension of household duties like baking bread or making cheese. The process is relatively simple. Mix malted barley with hot water. Add herbs for flavouring, since hops won't become standard for centuries yet. Let it ferment for a few days, and you've got ale. Simple in theory. Anyway, in practice, brewing good ale requires skill, experience, and a certain intuitive understanding of fermentation that separates the adequate brewers from the exceptional ones. You know that right now, even as full darkness settles over the village. Agnes's cottage will still have a handful of customers nursing their final cups. Not many. Most people have already retreated to their homes as you have, but there are always a few who push the boundaries of curfew, who squeeze out those last precious minutes of social time before surrendering to sleep. These are usually the younger men, the unmarried ones who have no wives waiting to scold them for staying out late. Or occasionally the older men whose marriages have gone cold and who find more warmth in ale and companionship than in their own beds. The alehouse serves a function that goes far beyond mere drinking. It's the village's social centre, the place where news circulates, where gossip gets refined into its most potent form, where alliances form and feuds deepen during daylight hours. It might host a dozen people at once, crowded onto benches or simply standing in the doorway because there's no room inside. People come to hear news from travellers, to complain about the Lord's latest demand for labour, to arrange marriages or business deals, to simply escape their own cramped cottages for an hour. The alewife hears everything, sees everything, knows everyone's secrets, which gives her a kind of power that transcends her official status as a mere widow running a small business. Historians still argue whether medieval alehouses were dens of vice and disorder or relatively peaceful community spaces. The truth, as usual, probably falls somewhere in between and varies wildly by location and proprietor. Some alewives ran tight operations, enforcing behaviour standards and ejecting troublemakers. Others presided over establishments that regularly descended into drunken chaos, fights breaking out over perceived insults or gambling debts. The church officially disapproved of alehouses, viewing them as sources of sin, drunkenness, gambling, sometimes prostitution, but even priests needed somewhere to drink, so the relationship was complicated. You can imagine the scene at Agnes's right now, maybe 4 or 5 men still lingering, sitting on rough benches pulled close to her hearth fire. The fire would still be burning. Bright ale houses kept their fires going later than ordinary cottages because customers expected light and warmth. The men would be drinking from wooden cups or leather jacks, the ale itself a thick, murky beverage that bears almost no resemblance to modern beer. Medieval ale was cloudy, relatively weak in alcohol content, maybe 2 or 3%, and had a short shelf life, going sour within days. That's why alewives brewed constantly, in small batches, selling it fresh. The conversation would be meandering by now, lubricated by several cups of ale, touching on the topics that always dominate village discourse. Someone would be complaining about the harvest either too wet or too dry, never quite right. Someone else would be spreading rumours about the merchant who passed through last week, the one who seemed to have too much silver for an honest trader. There'd be crude jokes about sex and bodily functions, the kind of humour that transcends centuries because apparently penis jokes were just as funny in 1320 as they are today. And there'd be genuine exchange of information which fields produced the best yield this year, whose cow is sick, whether the bailiff is planning another round of tax collection. Agnes herself would be moving through the space, refilling cups from a wooden pitcher, collecting coins, actual silver pennies if her customers are feeling prosperous, or more likely accepting promises of future payment or barter goods. The medieval economy ran on credit and exchange as much as on currency. A customer might pay for his ale with a dozen eggs, or a promise to help with Agnes's roof repair, or simply an IOU that would be settled at some undefined future date. Record-keeping was minimal. Most transactions existed only in memory and communal agreement about who owed what to whom. Here's a detail that surprises modern people. Alewives were subject to surprisingly strict regulations. The assize of ale, a set of laws governing brewing and selling specified maximum prices, required consistent quality and threatened heavy fines for violations. Ale tasters, official inspectors appointed by the manor lord, would periodically check the quality of ale being sold, supposedly by pouring some onto a wooden bench and then sitting on it in leather breeches. If the ale was properly brewed, it wouldn't be sticky and their breeches wouldn't stick to the bench. If it was badly made with too much sugar or poor ingredients, they'd stick fast. Whether this method actually worked or was just medieval pseudoscience is debatable, but the regulations were real and alewives who violated them could face serious financial penalties. You've been to Agnes's alehouse countless times yourself, though never late into the evening like this. Your visits are usually brief, squeezed into the margins of the workday, a quick cup during a break from field labour, or stopping by on your way home to hear if there's any news worth knowing. You like Agnes well enough. She's sharp-tongued but fair. Doesn't water her ale the way some brewers do. Doesn't cheat on the measurements. Her cottage smells of fermentation, a yeasty, slightly sour smell that clings to everything, and her hands are perpetually damp from handling the brewing equipment. The last customers will be leaving soon, stumbling out into the darkness with ale-blurred vision, navigating the village paths more by memory than sight. This is technically illegal, being abroad after curfew, but the night watchman usually looks the other way for alehouse stragglers unless they're being particularly disruptive. There's an understanding that men need their ale and their conversation, and as long as they are making their way home and not causing trouble, authority will exercise discretion, of course. If the bailiff happens to be in a foul mood or needs to meet his quota of fines for the month, those same stragglers might find themselves arrested and facing penalties. Agnes will bank her fire last of all the villagers, making sure every spark is properly contained before she finally allows herself to sleep. The alehouse represents her livelihood, her independence, her survival as a widow in a world that doesn't have much space for women without male protection. A fire that destroyed her cottage would destroy everything, leaving her dependent on village charity or forced into a desperate remarriage. So she's meticulous about fire safety, checking and double-checking, sometimes lying awake listening for any sound that might indicate danger. You wonder idly if Thomas the ploughman is still there, nursing his cup, reluctant to return to his own cottage where his wife waits with a list of complaints about his drinking. Or maybe young William, the blacksmith's apprentice, hoping to catch Agnes in a generous mood and convince her to extend more credit. The alehouse is its own little world, operating on different rules than the rest of the village. A pocket of prolonged sociability in a community otherwise forced into isolation by darkness and curfew. But even the alehouse must eventually yield to the night. Agnes will finish cleaning her brewing equipment by the firelight, already planning tomorrow's batch, calculating how much malt she has left and whether she needs to trade for more. She'll count her meagre earnings from the day, hiding the coins in whatever secret spot she'd chosen a crack in the wall, a hollow in the floor beam, somewhere the casual thief won't think to look. And then she too will bank her fire, bar her door, and surrender to sleep, the alehouse falling silent until tomorrow when the whole cycle begins again. The village gossip that circulates through Agnes's establishment will spread outward tomorrow, filtered through dozens of retellings, growing more elaborate or more simplified depending on the teller. This is how information moves in a medieval village slowly, organically, transformed in the telling. There are no newspapers, no official announcements beyond the occasional proclamation read at church. Everything you know about the wider world comes through word of mouth, through travellers' tales, through the intricate web of gossip and rumour that Agnes's alehouse helps weave. Your children are still not quite asleep. Despite the darkness and the late hour and the exhaustion that should be pulling them under, you can hear them shifting on their pallet, whispering to each other in voices they think are quiet but which carry clearly across the small cottage. Your wife makes another shushing sound, more insistent this time, but children operate on their own timeline, and sleep comes when it comes, not when parents demand it. The concept of a fixed bedtime is alien to medieval life. People sleep when darkness and exhaustion make sleep inevitable, and children are no exception to this rule. The sleeping arrangements in your cottage are typical for your social class, which is to say they're simultaneously communal and chaotic. You don't have beds in the modern sense, those are luxuries reserved for the wealthy. Elaborate wooden frames with rope supports and actual mattresses stuffed with feathers or wool. What you have are pallets, essentially large cloth sacks stuffed with straw, laid directly on the floor, shared by multiple people. Your children share one pallet, all four of them arranged in whatever configuration allows them to fit, which means the younger ones often get crushed by the older ones, elbows end up in faces, and someone always wakes up having been pushed halfway off onto the bare floor. Your oldest son, the 10-year-old who helped you wrangle the pig earlier, has claimed the position nearest the wall, which offers some stability and protection from being rolled on. Next to him is your 8-year-old daughter, then the 5-year-old boy, and finally the 3-year-old girl on the outer edge where she's most likely to fall off, but also where her inevitable nighttime crying will disturb the fewest people. It's a system that evolved through trial and error, through countless nights of experimentation with different arrangements, and it works well enough that you don't question it anymore. The children sleep in their day clothes, the same rough woolen tunics they wore all day, and will wear again tomorrow and the day after that, until they're so filthy or tattered that washing or mending becomes unavoidable. The concept of pyjamas, of special clothing worn only for sleeping, would strike medieval peasants as bizarre and wasteful. Clothes are expensive, difficult to make, and worn until they literally fall apart. You own perhaps 2 or 3 tunics total, rotating between them, and your children have even fewer. When their clothes become too small, they're passed down to the next youngest child, patched and repatched until the original fabric is barely visible beneath the repairs. Historians still argue whether medieval children were emotionally damaged by the lack of privacy and individual sleeping space, or whether this communal sleeping arrangement actually provided comfort and security that modern isolated bedrooms cannot replicate. Some scholars suggest that sleeping alone, the modern ideal for children old enough to manage it, would have struck medieval people as cruel, even dangerous. Why would you force a child to face the darkness alone when the whole family could huddle together, protected by numbers and shared warmth? Your own pallet, shared with your wife, is marginally better than the children's only because it's slightly thicker and because 2 adults produce less chaos than 4 children. You sleep on your side. Your wife pressed against your back in the position you've occupied for so many years that your bodies have memorized the arrangement. Her breathing is already slowing, deepening, as she drops towards sleep with the ease of someone who's been exhausted every single day of her adult life. Physical labor produces a particular kind of tiredness that makes sleep come fast and hard, dreamless and deep. The straw inside the pallets rustles with every movement, a constant soft crackling that becomes part of the nighttime soundscape. The straw needs changing. It's compressed into uncomfortable lumps and probably harbouring insects, maybe even mice who've tunnelled in to make nests. But fresh straw means going to whoever controls the grain storage and either paying for it or trading something of value. And right now you have neither coin nor surplus goods to spare. So the straw stays, getting more compressed and less comfortable with each passing week, until it becomes truly intolerable and you're forced to deal with the problem. Your 5-year-old son suddenly sits up on the pallet, and you could see his silhouette in the dim glow from the banked fire. "Papa," he says, his voice carrying that particular tone children use when they are about to request something they know is unreasonable. "I need to piss." This is the announcement every parent dreads after everyone has finally settled, after the door has been barred and the fire banked and the animals arranged. Because in a medieval cottage, going to the bathroom isn't a simple matter of walking down a hallway to a convenient indoor facility. You sigh, loud enough that your son knows you're not pleased, but quiet enough that you're not actually angry. This is just life with children. After all, "Use the pot," you tell him, and you hear him shuffling toward the corner where the chamber pot sits, a crude ceramic vessel that serves as the family's nighttime toilet. The pot is already partially full from earlier use, and you know from experience that by morning it will be filled nearly to the brim with the night's accumulated urine and possibly feces, creating a smell that will make emptying it first thing in the morning an unpleasant but absolutely necessary task. The sound of your son urinating into the pot is loud in the quiet cottage, a splashing that seems to go on forever. Medieval people had no shame about bodily functions. Privacy around elimination was another luxury that didn't exist at your social level. Everyone heard everyone else piss and shit. Everyone smelled everyone else's waste. Everyone accepted this as simply part of living in close quarters with other humans. Modesty about natural functions was for the wealthy, who had separate privy chambers and servants to deal with the mess. Here's a detail that rarely makes it into romantic tales of medieval life. Chamber pots were emptied directly into the street, usually first thing in the morning, but sometimes during the night if they became too full. People simply opened their doors or shutters and tossed the contents into the gutter or onto the midden heap, hopefully checking first that nobody was passing by. The streets of medieval villages were essentially open sewers, accumulating human and animal waste that would sit there until rain washed it away or it soaked into the ground. The smell must have been extraordinary, especially in summer, though again, when everyone lives in the same conditions, the baseline for normal adjusts accordingly. Your son finishes and shuffles back to the pallet, stepping on his sister's hand in the process, which causes a brief explosion of whispered accusations and retaliations before your wife's sharp "enough" cuts through the squabbling. Silence falls again, though you can still hear suppressed giggles from the older children who find their siblings' misfortunes endlessly entertaining. The chamber pot sits in its corner, adding its distinctive ammonia smell to the cottage's already complex bouquet of odours. The 3-year-old, disturbed by her brother's movement and her sister's outcry, begins to whimper. It's a sound you recognise immediately. She's not fully awake, but she's not asleep either. Caught in that liminal state where the wrong stimulus will trigger full crying, your wife responds automatically, making soothing sounds without even fully waking, reaching out to pat the child's back. The whimpering subsides, replaced by the rhythmic breathing that signals the child has dropped back into sleep. Medieval childhood was simultaneously harder and easier than modern childhood in ways that are difficult to reconcile. Children worked from early ages, faced genuine dangers, lived with constant discomfort, and had essentially no privacy or individual attention. Yet they also had tremendous freedom within the village boundaries, operated in tight-knit sibling groups, and existed within a community where everyone knew them and looked out for them. Your children have never been alone, never experienced the isolation that modern children sometimes feel. They're always surrounded by family, by animals, by neighbours so close that conversations carry through walls. The cottage is finally genuinely settling into quiet now. The children's breathing has synchronised into the deep, regular rhythm of true sleep. The animals have all found their positions and stopped moving. The goat occasionally sighs a surprisingly human sound, and the chickens make small sleepy clucks. But otherwise the menagerie is still. Your wife is definitely asleep now. You can tell by the complete relaxation of her body against yours. The slight whistle in her breathing that emerges only when she's deeply unconscious. You lie there in the darkness, not quite ready for sleep yourself despite your exhaustion. Your mind is still processing the day, replaying moments, worrying about tomorrow's labour, thinking about the approaching winter and whether you've stored enough food to see the family through. These quiet moments between settling down and actual sleep are the closest thing you get to privacy, to time alone with your own thoughts. Soon enough, you'll drop into unconsciousness and the night will pass in what feels like an instant. But for now, you're suspended between waking and sleeping, listening to your family breathe, feeling the warmth of bodies pressed close, existing in the profound darkness of a medieval night. Morning will bring the task you've been deliberately not thinking about, emptying the chamber pot and dealing with the night's accumulated waste. But that unpleasantness is hours away, and right now you're trying to ignore the smell already emanating from the corner where the pot sits, already fuller than you'd like. The medieval approach to human waste was straightforward to the point of being shocking by modern standards. What comes out of the body must go somewhere, and that somewhere was usually the nearest convenient outdoor location. With minimal concern for sanitation or public health, you know that when dawn finally breaks, you'll grab the chamber pot by its handle, trying not to slosh the contents, and carry it to your door. You'll open that door onto the village street and simply toss the entire mess into the gutter that runs down the centre of the path. A channel that's supposed to drain rainwater but in practice serves as the village's communal sewer. Every household does the same thing, which means the street is perpetually coated in a layer of human and animal excrement mixed with mud, spoiled food, and whatever else people decide to throw out their doors. The technical term for this practice was night soil disposal, though calling it a practice dignifies what was really just people throwing shit into the street because there was nowhere else to put it. Some villages had regulations requiring residents to clean the area in front of their own cottages. But enforcement was spotty at best. More commonly, the waste simply accumulated until heavy rains washed it away, or until it decomposed enough to blend with the mud and become indistinguishable from the general filth that characterized medieval streets. Historians still argue whether medieval people understood the connection between waste disposal and disease, or whether they simply accepted illness as God's will and never made the connection. The evidence is mixed. Some medical texts from the period suggest an awareness that bad smells and corrupted air could cause sickness, which isn't far from germ theory, even if the mechanism wasn't understood. Other sources show people casually living in conditions that would horrify modern health inspectors, apparently unbothered by the proximity of their drinking water to their waste disposal sites. Here's a detail that's both fascinating and revolting in larger towns and cities. Some entrepreneurial souls made their living collecting human waste to sell to farmers as fertilizer. These gong farmers or rakers would go house to house with carts, literally scooping up excrement from cesspits and privies, then transporting it to agricultural fields where it would be spread to enrich the soil. It was considered one of the lowest, most degrading jobs available. Yet it was also necessary and actually quite lucrative, since farmers desperately needed fertilizer and human waste was rich in nitrogen. Your village is too small for such specialized labor, so the waste simply stays where it's thrown until nature processes it. The street in front of your cottage is a hazard zone, especially after dark when you can't see where you're stepping. More than once, you've gone out at night for some urgent reason and stepped directly into a fresh pile of someone's nighttime deposit, feeling it squelch between your toes since you're too poor to own shoes. The experience is unpleasant, but not rare enough to be remarkable. It's just another indignity of peasant life. Another thing you endure because you have no choice. The smell is what strikes modern people as most unbearable when they try to imagine medieval life. Your cottage right now contains the mingled odours of unwashed human bodies, animal waste, smoke from the banked fire, spoiled food scraps, damp wool, and the sharp ammonia smell of the chamber pot, yet you barely notice it because your nose is adapted. The same way people who live near factories or farms stop smelling the industrial or agricultural odours that visitors find overwhelming. Your olfactory baseline has adjusted to accommodate a level of stench that would make a modern person gag. There's actually a social hierarchy to waste disposal methods, so... The truly wealthy nobles in their manor houses have guard-robe chambers, essentially small rooms built into the castle or manor walls, with holes that allow waste to drop down into moats or pits below. It's not exactly hygienic, but it does move the waste away from living spaces. Middling sorts, well-off peasants and merchants might have outdoor privies, small wooden structures built over pits dug specifically for waste collection. These pits eventually fill up and have to be cleaned out, which is where those gong farmers come in. But your family belongs to the bottom tier of the social pyramid, and the bottom tier uses chamber pots and street gutters because that's all you can afford. You don't have space for a dedicated privy structure, don't have the resources to dig and maintain a cesspit, don't have the coin to pay someone else to deal with your waste. So you do what peasants have done for centuries, you toss it into the street and hope the rain comes soon to wash it away. Your 8-year-old daughter shifts on the pallet, and you tense slightly, hoping she's not about to announce her own need for the chamber pot. But she settles again without waking, and you relax. The pot is already quite full. Another user might push it to overflowing, which would create a mess that would have to be dealt with immediately regardless of the hour. You've had that happen before, a pot tipped over in the darkness, its contents spreading across the floor, soaking into the straw, creating a disaster that required lighting a candle and cleaning up while everyone else tried to sleep. The medieval relationship with bodily waste was remarkably casual compared to modern squeamishness. People urinated in public without shame. Men would simply step to the side of the road and relieve themselves while continuing conversations. Women were expected to be slightly more discreet, but only slightly. Chamber pots were used during social gatherings. Guests would excuse themselves to a corner, do their business in full hearing of everyone else, and return to the conversation without comment. The idea that elimination should be a private, shameful activity hidden behind locked doors was a later development, a product of increased wealth and changed attitudes that your medieval self would find puzzling. There's even evidence that urine was collected deliberately for various industrial purposes. Tanners used it to cure leather. The ammonia helped remove hair from hides. Dyers used stale urine as a mordant to set colours in fabric. Some households actually kept separate containers for collecting urine to sell to these craftsmen, turning a waste product into a minor source of income. Nothing was truly wasted in the medieval economy. Even excrement had potential value if you could find someone willing to pay for it. You can hear, faintly, the sound of someone else in the village making a nighttime trip to their chamber pot. The sound carries through the thin walls, a reminder that everyone is dealing with the same biological necessities, the same lack of convenient facilities, the same indignity of squatting over a pot in the darkness. There's a strange democracy in it. King and peasant alike must shit, must piss, must find some way to dispose of what their bodies produce. The difference lies only in how far removed they can get from the actual process, and how much they can pay others to handle the unpleasant details. Your youngest child, the 3-year-old, hasn't quite mastered nighttime bladder control yet. You know from experience that she'll wet herself at least once during the night, soaking her clothes and probably whoever is sleeping next to her. It's expected, accepted, not even worth commenting on. In the morning, the wet clothes will be changed if dry ones are available, or simply left to air dry on her body if they're not. Washing and drying clothes is such an enormous task that it happens only when absolutely necessary, and a little urine soaking doesn't quite meet that threshold. The chamber pot in the corner continues its silent accusation, its smell growing more noticeable as your nose momentarily breaks through its habituation. You make a mental note to empty it at the earliest possible moment tomorrow, before the sun is even fully up, to at least minimize the time you and your family have to endure its presence. But that's tomorrow's problem. Right now, in this quiet hour after sunset, you're simply existing in the space between waking and sleeping, trying not to think too hard about the various unpleasant realities that define your daily existence. The goat chooses this moment to urinate, a long streaming sound followed by the smell of fresh animal waste joining the cottage's complex aromatic profile. Nobody stirs. This too is perfectly normal, just another element in the medieval symphony of bodily functions that modern people have worked so hard to hide, deny, and pretend don't exist. Your medieval body produces waste constantly, and your medieval life requires constant management of that waste. And there's simply no escaping the reality that humans are animals who eat and drink and therefore must also excrete. Before sleep can fully claim you, there's one final ritual that must be performed, one that your wife has already begun without any prompting or discussion. You hear her whispering prayers in the darkness, her voice so low it's barely audible. The familiar Latin phrases she learned from her mother, who learned them from her mother, passed down through generations of women who couldn't read but could memorize the sounds well enough to repeat them. The words themselves are mostly meaningless to her. She doesn't speak Latin, has no idea what she's actually saying, but the rhythm is what matters. the act of saying them, the protection they're supposed to provide. You add your own prayers to hers, speaking equally softly, equally automatically. Pater noster qui es in caelis. The Lord's Prayer, the one prayer every Christian in Europe knows regardless of literacy or education level. You've said these words thousands of times, so many times that your mouth forms them without conscious thought, your mind free to wander while your lips perform their duty. The prayer is insurance, a nightly investment in divine protection that might keep your family safe until morning. The medieval night was genuinely terrifying in ways that modern people, safe in their locked houses with police departments on call, struggle to comprehend. Darkness wasn't just the absence of light, it was the presence of danger, both real and imagined. Real dangers included thieves, wild animals, fires, and simple accidents in the dark. Imagined dangers, though your medieval mind doesn't distinguish between real and imagined, included demons, ghosts, evil spirits, witches, and all manner of supernatural entities that were believed to be most active after sunset. The church taught that night belonged to the devil, that darkness was literally his domain where evil flourished while good Christian souls slept. Demons prowled in the shadows, looking for opportunities to snatch unprotected souls or lead them into sin. The dead walked, especially those who had died violently or unshriven, doomed to wander until they found peace or revenge. Fairies and other pagan holdovers still haunted the edges of Christian belief, particularly in rural areas like yours, where old superstitions died hard despite centuries of official Christianity. Historians still argue whether medieval people genuinely believed in these supernatural threats, or whether the beliefs were more performative, cultural habits maintained without deep conviction. The evidence suggests genuine belief was widespread and deeply felt. People confessed to seeing ghosts, to being attacked by demons, to witnessing supernatural events. Whether these experiences were real, imagined, or the product of natural phenomena misinterpreted through a supernatural lens is ultimately unknowable. But the fear was certainly real. So you pray. You pray to God, to Jesus, to the Virgin Mary, to your patron saint whose name you were given at baptism and whose protection you've claimed ever since. You pray for protection through the night, for safety from evil, for the strength to wake again when morning comes. Your prayers are transactional, you're offering devotion in exchange for safety, but they're also desperate. You have so little control over your life, so few ways to protect yourself and your family from the countless threats that surround you. Prayer is one of the only tools available, and you use it. Your children, hearing their parents pray, add their own small voices to the nighttime devotions. The older ones know the words well enough to recite them properly. The younger ones approximate, making sounds that are close enough to the actual prayers that God will hopefully understand the intent, even if the execution is flawed. Your 3-year-old daughter, barely awake, murmurs something that might be prayer or might just be sleepy nonsense. It doesn't matter. She's trying, and surely God credits the effort even from one so young. The cottage has a single religious object, a wooden cross hanging on the wall near the door, crudely carved from oak, darkened with age and smoke. It's not much no wealthy family's elaborate crucifix with a silver Christ figure, but it's a physical reminder of divine presence, a focal point for prayers, a symbol that this household belongs to Christendom. You can't see it now in the darkness, but you know exactly where it hangs, and your prayers are directed toward that spot as though God resides specifically in that piece of carved wood. Here's a quirky detail about medieval prayer practices. Many families believed that certain prayers had to be said in specific positions to be effective. Some prayers required kneeling, others standing, others could be said lying down, There were prayers for waking, prayers for sleeping, prayers for eating, prayers for working, prayers for literally every activity of daily life. The church provided this elaborate framework of devotion, and ordinary people followed it to the best of their ability, though the details often got muddled in the transmission from priest to peasant. Your wife's prayers shift from Latin to the vernacular, switching to English as she adds personal petitions to the formal liturgy. Keep the children healthy, Lord. Keep the bailiff from demanding more than we can pay. Keep the harvest good next year. Keep the animals safe through the winter. These are the prayers that matter most, the desperate pleas from someone who understands exactly how precarious survival is, how easily everything could fall apart with one stroke of bad luck. You add your own petitions, equally practical. Keep my back strong for the work ahead. Keep the Lord from requiring too many extra Labour days. Keep the roof from collapsing when the winter snows come. Keep us all alive until spring. Prayer in the medieval world wasn't primarily about spiritual transcendence or moral improvement. It was about survival, about begging supernatural forces for help with the grinding, relentless challenges of daily existence. The church taught that prayer should be selfless, focused on God's glory rather than personal needs. But the church's teachings often collided with the reality of peasant life. You prayed for what you needed, asked for what you desperately wanted, bargained with God like you'd bargain with a merchant. If I'm faithful, if I attend Mass, if I say my prayers, then you'll protect me and mine. It was a contract, and you held up your end as best you could while hoping God would honour his. There's genuine comfort in the prayers, beyond any potential supernatural protection they might provide. The familiar words, repeated nightly, create a rhythm and structure that helps settle your mind towards sleep. The act of praying together as a family reinforces bonds, reminds everyone that you're united, not just by blood but by shared faith, shared hopes, shared fears. In a world of constant uncertainty, prayer provides at least the illusion of control, the sense that you're doing something to protect yourself rather than just passively accepting whatever fate throws at you. Your wife finishes her prayers with a final Amen that echoes softly in the cottage. The children's voices trail off one by one, the older ones finishing properly, the younger ones simply stopping mid-word as sleep finally claims them. You conclude your own prayers with the sign of the cross, touching forehead, chest, left shoulder, right shoulder, a gesture so automatic that your hand performs it without conscious direction. The cottage falls into deeper silence now, the kind of silence that only comes when everyone has stopped talking and started the slide toward unconsciousness. The prayers have marked the official transition from waking to sleeping, from the day's concerns to the night's surrender. Whatever happens now is in God's hands, beyond your control, and there's a strange relief in that acknowledgement. You've done what you can, secured the door, banked the fire, said your prayers. The rest is up to forces beyond your understanding or influence. You can feel your wife relaxing more completely against you, her body softening as prayer transitions into sleep. Her breathing deepens, slows, takes on the regular rhythm that signals she's gone. The children are already silent, their small bodies still on the pallet, their exhausted minds having finally surrendered to the rest they so desperately need. Even the animals seem quieter, as though the prayers have settled them too. Or perhaps they simply respond to the decreased human activity in the cottage. The darkness feels different now, less threatening somehow, as though the prayers have created an invisible barrier between your family and whatever dangers lurk in the night. It's properly psychological, your mind playing tricks on itself, finding comfort in familiar rituals, But maybe it's real. Maybe God does listen, does protect, does keep special watch over those who remember to ask for his help. You don't know, can't know, but you believe because belief is all you have. The wooden cross on the wall stands invisible guard through the night, a silent sentinel blessed by the priest during one of his infrequent visits to the village. Some families have holy water that they sprinkle in corners to keep demons away, or religious medals hung over doorways, or prayers written on scraps of parchment and hidden in the walls. Your family has just the cross, but it's enough. It has to be enough because it's all you can afford. Sleep is creeping closer now, pulling at the edges of your consciousness, making your thoughts fuzzy and disconnected. The prayers have done their work, settling your mind, easing your fears enough that rest becomes possible. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges, its own fears, its own need for divine protection. But that's tomorrow. Tonight. You've prayed. You've placed your family under God's protection. And now you can finally let go and trust that morning will come again. Just as you're finally beginning to drift towards sleep, you hear the distinctive shuffle and thump of footsteps outside, accompanied by the faint glow of lantern light that seeps through the cracks in your shutters. The village watchman has begun his first round of the night, and his presence is both reassuring and slightly ominous. You know it's Robert's son, Geoffrey, a man of about 30 who supplements his meagre income as a farm labourer by serving as one of the village's 2 night watchmen. His shift runs from full darkness until roughly midnight, when the other watchman will take over for the remainder of the night. Geoffrey's footsteps are uneven. Limping slightly from an old injury, you remember it happening several years ago when a plough blade caught his foot and nearly took off his toes. He walks with a staff that serves multiple purposes: support for his bad leg, weapon against potential threats, and noisemaker to announce his presence. Every few steps, he taps the staff against the ground, creating a rhythmic pattern that's become as much a part of the village's nighttime soundscape as dog barks and crying babies. You can hear him pause outside your cottage, and then his voice rings out in the traditional watchman's call, 10 of the clock and all is well, God keep you through the night. His voice is strong despite the late hour, trained to carry across the village, to penetrate through walls and shutters so that sleeping families know someone is watching, someone is alert to danger while they rest. The call is as much about reassurance as information, yes. It tells you the approximate time, but more importantly it tells you that the social order is functioning, that the village's defences are manned, that you're not entirely alone in the darkness. Historians still argue whether night watchmen were effective deterrents against crime and danger, or whether they were merely security theatre, providing psychological comfort without much practical protection. The evidence suggests they fell somewhere in between. A watchman couldn't stop a determined group of bandits or prevent a house fire from spreading once it started, but he could raise the alarm, wake the village, and provide those crucial early minutes of warning that might mean the difference between manageable crisis and total disaster. Geoffrey's duties are straightforward but demanding. He's supposed to patrol the entire village circuit, walking the perimeter along the inside of the earthen embankments, then cutting through the centre along the main paths, completing each circuit roughly every hour. He's watching for fires primarily, since that's the most likely and most dangerous threat, but he's also listening for signs of trouble, sounds of breaking and entering, cries for help, unusual animal behaviour that might signal predators or intruders. He's supposed to check that doors are secured and fires are properly banked, though in practice he mostly just walks his route and hopes nothing goes wrong on his watch. The pay for this work is minimal, perhaps a few pennies per night, plus the privilege of gleaning extra grain from the Lord's fields during harvest. It's not enough to live on, which is why Geoffrey also works as a day labourer and tends a small plot of land his wife somehow manages while also raising their 6 children. The night watchman position is less a job than a duty that rotates among able-bodied village men, though some individuals like Geoffrey end up doing more shifts than others because they need the tiny bit of extra income or because they're particularly suited to the work. You can hear Geoffrey moving on to the next cottage, his staff tapping, his voice calling out the hour again. 10 of the clock and all is well. The repetition is part of the ritual, the reassurance that comes from predictability and routine. In a world full of uncertainty and danger, there's comfort in knowing that Geoffrey will pass by at roughly the same time each night, will call out the same words, will maintain the same vigilant presence until his shift ends and the next watchman takes over. Here's a detail that surprises modern people: the night watchman's calls actually serve to regulate time in communities without clocks. Most peasants had no way of knowing the hour except by the sun's position during daylight, or by the watchman's calls during darkness. Geoffrey's announcements 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock. Midnight provided the framework around which nocturnal time was organised. If you woke in the night and heard 2 of the clock, you knew how much darkness remained before dawn, how much longer you could sleep before the day's labour resumed. The lantern Geoffrey carries is a simple affair, a candle or rushlight, enclosed in a frame of horn or oiled parchment to protect the flame from wind. It provides just enough light to see a few feet ahead, to avoid stumbling into wells or tripping over debris in the paths, but not enough to truly illuminate the darkness. He walks in a small bubble of yellow light that moves with him, leaving deeper darkness in his wake. From inside your cottage, you can track his progress by watching the glow shift and fade as he moves from house to house. Sometimes, Geoffrey finds actual problems on his rounds. Last month, he discovered that Thomas the ploughman had left his hearth fire burning too high, flames actually licking up the chimney in a way that could have ignited the thatched roof. Geoffrey banged on the door, woke Thomas, and made him properly bank the coals, probably saving the entire row of cottages from fire. 2 months before that, Geoffrey interrupted a theft in progress, someone from the next village over trying to steal a goat from a pen. The thief ran off into the darkness before Geoffrey could identify him, but the goat was saved. More commonly, Geoffrey's rounds are entirely uneventful. He walks his circuit, calls his hours, sees nothing more alarming than a cat slinking through shadows or a dog investigating interesting smells. The boring nights are actually the successful nights. They mean the village is secure, that everyone is safe in their beds, that the darkness holds no immediate threats. But boring doesn't mean easy. Walking the same route hour after hour in the cold and dark, fighting to stay alert when exhaustion pulls at your eyelids, requires its own kind of endurance. You drift towards sleep again, Geoffrey's fading footsteps becoming part of the background noise, his voice growing fainter as he moves to the far side of the village. You know he'll circle back around in an hour, calling out 11 o'clock, maintaining his vigil while the village sleeps. There's something almost paternal about the watchman's role. He's like a father checking on sleeping children, making sure they're safe, providing protection they're not even aware of receiving. The tradition of night watchmen stretches back centuries and will continue for centuries more, persisting until gas lamps and eventually electric streetlights make the darkness less absolute and police forces take over the role of nighttime security. But in your medieval village, Geoffrey and his counterpart are the only organised defence against whatever the night might bring. It's not much, just one man with a limp and a staff and a lantern barely bright enough to see his own feet. But it's better than nothing, better than facing the darkness entirely alone. Your wife hasn't stirred at Geoffrey's passage. She's accustomed to the watchman's calls, her sleeping mind filtering them out as routine and unthreatening. The children likewise sleep through the interruption. too exhausted to wake for anything less than immediate danger. Even the animals barely react. The goat opens one eye briefly, then closes it again. The chickens remain motionless on their beam. The pig continues his snoring undisturbed. You wonder idly if Geoffrey is lonely out there in the dark, walking his solitary rounds while everyone else sleeps. Does he resent the duty, or does he find a certain peace in the solitude? Does the darkness frighten him, or has familiarity bred comfort? You'll never know, because asking such questions would be strange, too personal, not the kind of thing men discuss. Geoffrey does his duty. You pay your share of the taxes that fund his pittance of wages, and the system continues functioning through mutual agreement and necessity. The cottage falls back into stillness after Geoffrey's passage, the brief interruption of his rounds absorbed back into the quiet. His next circuit will come in an hour, then another hour after that, marking time's passage through the night in predictable intervals. For now, you're sliding back towards sleep, secure in the knowledge that someone is watching, someone is alert, someone will sound the alarm if danger approaches. It's not perfect protection, far from it, but it's what the village can afford. And somehow, it's enough. Sleep finally claims you, pulling you down into unconsciousness with the weight of exhaustion earned through another day of back-breaking labour. But medieval sleep isn't the uninterrupted 8-hour block that modern people consider normal and necessary. Instead, you drift in and out of awareness, your rest fragmented by the constant soundtrack of village night sounds that penetrate the thin walls of your cottage. Even in sleep, part of your brain remains alert, monitoring these sounds, distinguishing between normal nighttime noise and potential threats that might require waking. The first sound that registers in your semi-conscious state is the distant barking of dogs. A cascade of canine voices starting from one end of the village and rippling outward as each dog responds to its neighbour's alarm. This happens multiple times each night, dogs reacting to cats, to foxes, to owls, to absolutely nothing discernible to human senses. You don't fully wake because the barking follows familiar patterns, the usual suspects making their usual complaints. If the pattern changed, if the barking took on a different quality or came from an unexpected direction, then you'd wake fully, alert to possible danger. But this is just dogs being dogs, and your sleeping mind catalogues it as non-threatening. A baby's cry cuts through the dog chorus, thin and insistent, coming from the cottage 3 doors down where young Margaret lives with her husband and their infant son. The baby has been colicky for weeks, crying for hours each night, and the entire neighbourhood has become unwilling participants in the family's exhaustion. You hear Margaret's voice, muffled through walls, singing a lullaby that wavers with tiredness. The baby's cries eventually subside to whimpers, then silence, and you drift deeper into sleep again, grateful that it's not your child disrupting the night this time. The cottage itself makes constant sounds, a symphony of creaks and groans as timber and thatch respond to temperature changes and wind. The roof beams contract slightly as the night air cools them, producing sharp cracks that sound alarmingly like footsteps on the roof, but which you've learned to recognise as harmless. The shutters rattle in their frames when gusts of wind hit them, creating a rhythmic banging that would drive a modern person mad, but which you've learned to sleep through. The door shifts in its frame, the wooden bar across it settling with small thuds that punctuate the night at irregular intervals. Historians still argue whether medieval people actually slept more deeply than modern people, or whether they simply adapted to sleeping in noisy, uncomfortable conditions through sheer necessity. Some scholars point to evidence that interrupted sleep was actually considered normal. People expected to wake multiple times during the night, and the concept of first sleep and second sleep was common in medieval and early modern writing. You'd sleep for a few hours after sunset, wake for an hour or two around midnight, then sleep again until dawn. During that wakeful interval, people prayed, had sex, talked with their spouses, or simply lay in the darkness thinking, you experience exactly this pattern tonight. Around what must be midnight, you hear Geoffrey's replacement calling 12 of the clock and God preserve us. You wake fully, your eyes opening to the complete darkness of the cottage. The banked fire has dimmed even further, just the faintest red glow visible if you stare directly at the hearth. Your wife is awake too. You can tell by her breathing and the way her body is tense slightly against yours. Neither of you speaks, but you both know the other is conscious, sharing this strange interval of nighttime wakefulness. This is when your mind becomes active in ways it never does during daylight hours, when physical labour occupies all your attention. Thoughts surface that you've been too busy to entertain during the day, worry about the approaching winter and whether you've stored enough food. Anxiety about the Lord's latest demand for extra labour service. Concern about your oldest son who seems too small and weak for his age. These thoughts circle through your consciousness, not quite organised enough to be called proper thinking, but too insistent to ignore. Your wife shifts beside you, and you know she's wrestling with her own nighttime anxieties. Perhaps she's worried about the children's health, about the strange cough your middle daughter developed last week, about whether the family's clothes will last another season or need costly replacement. Medieval women carried enormous burdens of household management, and the nighttime hours often brought those burdens into sharp focus, away from the distracting bustle of daily activity. Outside, you hear footsteps, someone making a nighttime trip to the privy, or perhaps just stepping outside to urinate rather than adding to an already full chamber pot. The footsteps are unsteady, suggesting either drunkenness or simple exhaustion-induced clumsiness. You recognise the pattern of movement as belonging to Harold the Cooper, whose cottage is directly across the path from yours. Harold has trouble with his bladder, gets up multiple times each night, and has become a familiar feature of the village soundscape. A cat yowls somewhere close by, that distinctive cry that signals either mating or fighting, both of which cats pursue with equal intensity and volume. The sound is answered by another cat, then another, until 3 or 4 felines are engaged in their nocturnal drama. You hear a door bang open, someone's irritated voice shouting at the cats to shut up. Then the door slamming closed again. The cats, unbothered by human displeasure, continue their caterwauling for several more minutes before finally dispersing. Here's a quirky detail about medieval nighttime life that rarely gets mentioned. People actually used these wakeful intervals productively. Women might do handwork that required minimal light spinning wool, mending clothes, braiding rope by feel alone or by the faint glow of banked embers. Men might sharpen tools, repair equipment, or perform other maintenance tasks that had been postponed during daylight working hours. Couples might have quiet conversations about household matters, make plans, or resolve disputes away from the daytime chaos of children and animals and neighbours. You and your wife don't speak during this wakeful interval, but you share a physical closeness that serves as its own form of communication. Her hand finds yours in the darkness, holds it briefly, releases it. The gesture says, "I'm here. We're together. We'll get through whatever comes." It's not romance. Medieval peasant marriages rarely had space for romantic love in the modern sense, but it's partnership. The deep bond that comes from shared struggle and mutual dependence. The darkness during this wakeful period feels different than evening darkness. Evening darkness still holds the day's residual energy, still feels connected to waking life. But midnight darkness is profound, absolute, a darkness that seems to have weight and presence. Without any artificial light, without even the moon visible through your shuttered windows, you're experiencing a level of darkness that's become virtually extinct in the modern world. Your hand held in front of your face is invisible. The cottage walls disappear into black. You exist in a space defined entirely by sound and touch rather than sight. Your children remain asleep throughout this interval, their breathing deep and regular, their small bodies motionless on the pallet. Children seem to possess a gift for sleep that adults have lost, an ability to sink into unconsciousness so complete that nothing short of immediate danger can disturb it. You envy them slightly, remembering when you too could sleep with such abandon, before adult worries and responsibilities made true rest elusive. The goat stirs in her corner, making small grunting sounds as she shifts position. You hear her hooves scrape against the floor, hear her chewing something, probably cud, since goats seem to spend half their lives chewing even when there is nothing in their mouths. The chickens are silent on their beam, completely still, as though they've achieved a state of suspended animation rather than mere sleep. Only the pig continues his rattling snore, a sound that's become so familiar it's almost comforting in its predictability. Gradually, after perhaps an hour of wakefulness, though time is impossible to measure accurately in the darkness, you feel sleep pulling at you again. Your thoughts begin to blur and drift, losing their sharp edges of worry and becoming softer, more disconnected. Your wife's breathing has already deepened again. She's returned to sleep while you are still wrestling with consciousness. You let yourself follow her down into that second sleep, the one that will carry you through until dawn, when the roosters crow and the returning light will drag you back to waking life and another day of endless labour. The sounds of the village continue unabated. Dogs bark, babies cry, cottages creak. The night watchman calls out the hours, but these sounds fade into the background as sleep reclaims you. Your last semi-conscious thought is a vague hope that this second sleep will be deeper, less interrupted, more restorative, but you know, with the resigned wisdom of experience, that you'll probably wake at least once more before morning, pulled from rest by a full bladder or a bad dream, or simply the ingrained habit of broken sleep that defines medieval nights. You've barely sunk back into your second sleep when a different sound pulls you toward consciousness, a sound that's wrong somehow, out of place in the usual nighttime symphony. It's furtive, deliberate. The careful shuffle of feet trying to move quietly combined with the soft scrape of something being dragged or pushed. Your eyes open in the darkness, your body tensing as you try to locate the source. For a moment, you wonder if someone is attempting to break into your cottage, but then you realize the sounds are coming from outside, from the narrow gap between houses where the shadows are deepest even during daylight. You remain perfectly still, listening intently, and gradually the picture becomes clear. Someone is sneaking through the village, moving between cottages with deliberate stealth, clearly trying to avoid detection. This isn't the watchman you'd recognize his limping gait and the tap of his staff. This is someone who has reason to hide their movements. And in a medieval village where everyone knows everyone's business, there are really only a few reasons for such secrecy. Theft is possible, though unlikely given how little anyone owns worth stealing. More probably, this is someone engaged in the other common nighttime transgression, illicit romance. The medieval church had very clear rules about sex and marriage, rules that were preached regularly from the pulpit and theoretically enforced through the manor courts. Sex was permitted only within marriage, and only for the purpose of procreation, and ideally only in positions the church approved. In practice, of course, Medieval people ignored these rules with impressive consistency. Premarital sex was common, adultery was frequent enough to be unremarkable, and people pursued their desires with whatever discretion they could manage, given the complete lack of privacy in village life. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants had more or less sexual freedom than modern people, and the answer seems to be it's complicated. On one hand, the church's rules were strict and the penalties for getting caught could be severe public penance, fines, even excommunication for repeat offenders. On the other hand, enforcement was spotty, social attitudes were often more permissive than official doctrine, and the sheer difficulty of maintaining surveillance in a world without electric lights meant that determined lovers could usually find opportunities if they were willing to take risks. You hear a door creak open very softly, not the main door which would make too much noise, but probably the small back entrance that some cottages have for bringing in firewood or allowing animals access. Then voices, barely audible, a man's low murmur and a woman's whispered response. You can't make out words, but the tone is intimate, conspiratorial, charged with the excitement and danger of forbidden activity. Somewhere in the village, a married woman is receiving a lover who is not her husband, or an unmarried couple is risking pregnancy and scandal, or perhaps a widower is visiting a widow in a relationship that's not quite respectable enough for daylight acknowledgement. The sounds continue for what feels like a long time, but is probably only minutes more whispers. The rustle of clothing, small gasps and sighs that suggest activities you can easily imagine. Medieval cottage walls provide almost no sound insulation, which means everyone hears everyone else's intimate moments whether they want to or not. You've heard your neighbours having sex countless times, just as they've surely heard you and your wife. Privacy is simply not a concept that has much meaning when families live packed together in single-room cottages with walls made of mud and sticks. Here's a detail that shocks modern people. Medieval communities often knew exactly who was sleeping with whom. Even when the relationships were supposed to be secret, the village operated on an economy of gossip where information was currency and everyone was both spy and subject. You probably have a pretty good idea of whose voices you're hearing right now. Even though you can't see them and can barely make out their words, their identities will be the subject of whispered conversations tomorrow. Theories will be tested against observed behaviour, and eventually consensus will emerge about who was sneaking where and with whom. Your wife is awake too, you can tell by the tension in her body pressed against yours. She's listening just as you are, probably recognising the same voices, drawing the same conclusions. But neither of you speaks or acknowledges what you're hearing. To speak would be to admit you're awake and listening, which would make you witnesses in a way that carries uncomfortable social obligations. Better to pretend sleep, to maintain plausible deniability, to let the nighttime transgressions remain in the shadows where they belong. The medieval attitude toward adultery and fornication was remarkably pragmatic beneath the surface of official disapproval. Yes, the church thundered against sexual sin, and yes, manor courts occasionally punished offenders. But everyone understood that human nature was human nature, that desire didn't respect property lines or marriage vows, that long winter nights and close quarters created opportunities that people would inevitably take. As long as pregnancies were rare enough, or could be attributed to husbands. As long as scandals didn't become so public, they demanded official action. Most villages maintained a kind of willful blindness toward the nighttime activities of their members. You hear movement again, the lovers separating, whispered farewells, the careful retreat of footsteps trying to maintain stealth, even though half the village is probably awake and listening. One set of footsteps moves away quickly, putting distance between the cottage and the visitor. The other retreats inside, the door closing with a soft click that's somehow louder in its quietness than a normal closing would be. then silence, or at least a return to the normal nighttime sounds of dogs and distant babies and creaking timbers. Your mind churns with speculation despite your exhaustion. If those voices belong to who you think they did, and you're fairly certain you recognized at least one of them, then there will be consequences eventually. Maybe a pregnancy that can't be explained away. Maybe a jealous spouse who notices unexplained absences. Maybe just the slow accumulation of gossip until the weight becomes too heavy to ignore. Medieval villages were small worlds where secrets had short lifespans, where everyone watched everyone else, where today's whispered scandal became tomorrow's public knowledge. There's no judgment in your thoughts, just observation and a kind of weary acceptance. You've lived your entire life in this village, seen this pattern repeat countless times. People want what they want, pursue what they desire. Take risks that seem foolish in retrospect but compelling in the moment. The church says it's sin. The manor court says it's punishable. But people do it anyway because the alternative, a lifetime of strict obedience to rules that deny basic human impulses, seems impossible to sustain. Your own marriage is stable enough, built on partnership and mutual need rather than passion. But even you can understand the appeal of something illicit, something chosen rather than arranged, something that belongs to the dark hours rather than the daylight world of obligations and surveillance. You'd never act on such impulses. The risks are too high, the consequences too severe, your position too precarious to gamble with. But you can understand those who do. The village settles back into quieter rhythms after the lovers' separation. The watchman makes another round, calling out, "One of the clock and all's quiet," a statement that's technically true but misses the more interesting story of what actually transpired in the shadows between his circuits. His lantern light sweeps past your cottage, and you see the brief illumination through cracks in the shutters. Then darkness returns as he moves on. Your wife's breathing has deepened again. She's returned to sleep, apparently satisfied that the nighttime drama has concluded without requiring any response from you. The children never stirred, lost in the deep sleep of exhausted youth. The animals remained settled in their corners, unbothered by human complications and desires. Only you remain awake, your thoughts circling through what you heard, what it means, what might happen next. Tomorrow, there will be meaningful glances exchanged between those who were awake and listening. There will be careful conversations where information is shared and theories refined. The village's collective intelligence will process tonight's events, file them away in the communal memory, add them to the ongoing narrative that everyone carries about everyone else. This is how reputation is built and destroyed, how social order is maintained not through official authority, but through the constant surveillance of neighbours who miss nothing and forget even less. You let your eyes close again, willing sleep to return even though your mind is still active. The night is more than half over, dawn will come in a few hours, bringing the merciful routine of work that leaves no mental space for dwelling on other people's secrets and sins. For now, you try to sink back into unconsciousness, to leave the complications of human desire and deception in the darkness where they belong, at least until morning when the whole cycle begins again. Sleep eludes you now, pushed away by the evening's disturbances and your own churning thoughts. You lie in the darkness, staring at nothing, and gradually become aware of other sounds filtering through the village voices, low and conversational, coming from the cottage 2 doors down where old Edmund lives with his 3 grown sons and their families. The voices have that particular quality of people who've given up on sleep and decided to make use of the wakeful hours instead. You can't make out specific words, but the rhythm suggests storytelling, that ancient nighttime occupation that predates written literature by millennia, medieval people were voracious consumers and creators of stories, particularly during the long dark hours when there was nothing else to do. Without books, almost no one in your village can read. And books are impossibly expensive luxury items anyway. Stories lived in memory and were transmitted orally from person to person, generation to generation. The content ranged wildly: religious tales of saints and martyrs, folklore about fairies and demons, gossip elevated to the status of narrative, family histories that blended fact and fiction until the two became indistinguishable. You can imagine the scene in Edmund's cottage right now. The family would be gathered close to the banked fire, using its faint glow as a focal point, bodies pressed together for warmth. Edmund himself, a man in his 60s, which makes him practically ancient, would be holding court, telling stories he learned from his grandfather who learned them from his grandfather. An unbroken chain of oral tradition stretching back beyond memory. His sons and daughters-in-law would be listening with that combination of familiarity and fresh interest that comes from hearing the same stories repeatedly, but finding new details or meanings with each telling. The stories would almost certainly include ghost tales. Medieval people were obsessed with ghosts and the supernatural, and the nighttime hours were considered the proper setting for such narratives. Edmund probably knows dozens of local ghost stories, the spirit of the miller who drowned in the millrace and whose moaning can supposedly be heard on foggy nights, the phantom riders who gallop through the forest, the woman in white who appears at the crossroads warning travellers of danger. These stories serve multiple functions: entertainment, obviously, but also social control, encoding warnings about dangerous places and dangerous behaviours in memorable narrative form. Historians still argue whether medieval people genuinely believed their ghost stories, or whether they maintained a sophisticated understanding that stories could be true in symbolic or moral terms without being literally factual. The evidence suggests most people existed in a kind of pragmatic ambiguity. They didn't quite believe, but didn't quite disbelieve either, maintaining a relationship with supernatural tales that allowed for multiple levels of interpretation depending on context and mood. Here's a fascinating detail about medieval storytelling. The best storytellers achieved a kind of celebrity status within their communities. Edmund's reputation as a storyteller probably extends beyond your village to neighbouring settlements. People would mention him, "Old Edmund from the village by the oak grove. He knows all the old tales." And travellers might deliberately route through your village hoping to spend an evening listening to his stories. In a world without professional entertainment, where boredom was a constant threat during dark winter months, a gifted storyteller was a valuable community resource. The stories Edmund tells tonight probably include some that would make the local priest deeply uncomfortable. Medieval Christianity never quite managed to stamp out the older pagan traditions that lurked beneath the surface of village life. Stories about fairies, about nature spirits, about magic wells and enchanted groves, these tales carried forward beliefs that predated Christianity by centuries. The Church tried to either absorb these traditions, turning pagan sites into Christian shrines, pagan festivals into Christian holy days, or condemn them as demonic. But in practice, most villages maintained a kind of dual belief system where Christian and pagan elements coexisted uneasily. You can hear laughter now from Edmund's cottage, genuine mirth at something in the story. Medieval humour was earthy and direct, focused heavily on bodily functions, sex, and the misfortunes of pompous authority figures. The same story might include fart jokes, adultery, a corrupt priest getting his comeuppance, and a moral lesson about Christian virtue. all woven together without any sense that these elements contradicted each other. The sacred and profane weren't separated into different spheres the way modern culture tends to divide them. Your wife shifts beside you, still asleep but dreaming perhaps, making small sounds that might be distress or might be nothing. You listen carefully, ready to wake her if the dream turns into a full nightmare, but she settles again without fully waking. Medieval people believed dreams were messages from God, from demons, from the dead, from the future trying to warn the present. Dreams were taken seriously, discussed and analysed, sometimes brought to the priest for interpretation if they seemed particularly significant or troubling. The storytelling in Edmund's cottage continues, the voices rising and falling in that rhythmic pattern that characterises oral narrative. You've heard Edmund tell stories before. Know his technique. He builds slowly, layering detail and tension, using his voice to create different characters, timing his pauses perfectly to maximise suspense. When he reaches the climax, the ghost's appearance, the hero's clever escape, the villain's punishment, his voice would rise dramatically, then drop to a whisper for the resolution, leaving his audience satisfied but also slightly unsettled, which is exactly the right emotional note for nighttime storytelling. These nighttime gatherings, these story circles in the dark hours, served crucial social functions beyond mere entertainment. They reinforced community bonds, transmitted cultural knowledge, taught moral lessons, preserved history however distorted, and gave people a shared narrative framework for understanding their world. The stories Edmund tells tonight have been shaped by hundreds of previous tellings, refined and polished through countless repetitions, adapted to fit changing circumstances while maintaining their essential core. Here's something modern people rarely consider in a world without mass media. Every storyteller essentially performed creative acts with each telling. There was no definitive correct version of any story. Each teller adapted the tale to their audience, their mood, their particular gifts. Edmund's version of the ghost at the millrace is different from the version told by Sarah the alewife, which is different from the version your grandmother used to tell. All three versions are true, in the sense that they're genuine expressions of the tradition, but none is authoritative or final. The stories also served as a kind of informal education, teaching children and newcomers about local geography, history, and social expectations. A tale about a traveller who ignored warnings and took a shortcut through the haunted woods teaches the very practical lesson that certain paths are dangerous and should be avoided. A story about a greedy merchant who cheated customers and was punished by supernatural forces reinforces community norms about fair dealing. The narrative form made these lessons memorable in ways that direct instruction never could be. You wonder if your own children, sleeping deeply on their pallet, will someday sit in cottage darkness telling these same stories to their children and grandchildren. Will they remember the tales you've told them? However imperfectly will they add their own variations, their own interpretations, keeping the tradition alive while also transforming it. The thought creates a strange sensation, a connection to both past and future, a sense of participating in something larger than your individual life. The voices from Edmund's cottage are quieting now, the energy of storytelling winding down as even the determined storyteller and his audience acknowledge the late hour and the coming need to rise for another day's work. You hear final murmurs, the sounds of people arranging themselves for sleep, then gradual silence punctuated only by the usual nighttime symphony of village sounds. In the darkness of your own cottage, you find yourself mentally reviewing stories you know, tales you might tell your children tomorrow night if they're restless or frightened. There's the one about the clever peasant who outwitted the devil, always a favourite. The story of St. Margaret and the Dragon, which your daughters particularly love despite or perhaps because of its gory details. The local legend about the village's founding, which may or may not have any historical truth, but which everyone agrees is a good story regardless. Storytelling in the medieval world wasn't separate from life. It was woven through life, giving shape and meaning to experiences that might otherwise seem random or senseless. When your neighbour's cow died mysteriously, the story about the witch who cursed livestock provided an explanation, however fantastical. When crops failed, stories about divine punishment for community sins offered a framework for understanding disaster. The stories weren't always comforting, but they were always meaningful, which in a harsh and unpredictable world might be even more valuable than comfort. You feel sleep finally returning, pulling at the edges of your consciousness with renewed insistence. The storytelling voices have fully ceased now. Edmund's cottage falling silent along with the rest of the village. The night is aging toward its darkest, stillest hours, that time just before dawn when even the most determined insomniacs usually surrender to exhaustion. Your thoughts grow fuzzy and disconnected, the stories in your mind blending with dreams, reality and narrative becoming indistinguishable as consciousness finally, mercifully, releases its grip and lets you fall into the deeper sleep that will carry you toward morning. You wake once more in the deepest part of the night, though wake might be too strong a word for the semi-conscious state you're experiencing. Your eyes open to absolute darkness. The banked fire has diminished to the point where it produces no visible light at all, just warmth you can feel but not see. For a disorienting moment, you're not entirely sure you're actually awake. The darkness is so complete that it has a physical quality, pressing against your eyeballs, filling your mouth and lungs, wrapping around you like a heavy blanket. This is the darkness that modern people almost never experience. The total absence of light that existed as the default human condition for millennia. No streetlights bleeding through curtains, no digital clock faces glowing, no standby indicator lights on electronics, no distant highway illumination on the horizon, just pure, absolute, primordial darkness that would be terrifying if you weren't so accustomed to it. Your pupils are dilated as wide as they'll go, desperately gathering whatever photons might exist. But there's simply nothing to see. The enforced quiet of this deepest night hour creates a strange paradox. The silence isn't actually silent at all, but rather filled with sounds that become hyper-audible in the absence of visual stimulation. Your hearing has sharpened to compensate for your useless vision, and you become aware of sounds you normally filter out. The breathing of your family members takes on individual character, your wife's slightly whistling exhale, your oldest son's deeper rhythm, the baby-quick breaths of your youngest. The animals contribute their own patterns, the goat's steady respiration, the chicken's almost imperceptible movement on their beam, the pig's rattling snore that never seems to vary. Historians still argue whether medieval people experienced this darkness as oppressive or whether they found comfort in it. A natural womb-like return to sensory deprivation that allowed deep rest impossible in the stimulation-saturated modern world. Contemporary accounts are surprisingly scarce. People rarely wrote about something as mundane and universal as darkness, but what evidence exists suggests a mixture of fear and familiarity. Darkness was dangerous, yes, but it was also predictable, returning every night with reliable consistency. Outside the cottage, the village has achieved its maximum quietude. Even the dogs have mostly fallen silent, exhausted from their earlier bouts of barking. The watchman's calls have ceased. You're between rounds, in that interval where he's somewhere on the far side of the village, his voice too distant to penetrate your cottage walls. The wind has died down, leaving the thatched roof still and silent above you. For a few precious minutes, the village approaches something resembling actual silence. A collective held breath in the darkness. Here's something that strikes modern people as almost magical when they first learn about it. Medieval people's night vision was significantly better than that of contemporary humans, without constant exposure to artificial light, without the blue light from screens that disrupts circadian rhythms and damages light-sensitive cells. Your eyes have retained the capacity for seeing in conditions that would leave a modern person effectively blind. Right now, as you lie in this absolute darkness, your eyes are slowly, painfully slowly, beginning to detect the faintest variations in the black, not enough to see shapes or objects, but enough to sense spatial relationships, to know where walls are, to orient yourself within the familiar geography of your cottage. Your bladder signals its fullness with increasing insistence, creating the dilemma that faces everyone in the deep night: endure the discomfort and try to return to sleep, or deal with it now and risk fully waking yourself. You lie there debating, knowing from experience that ignoring the signal will only make it worse, will lead to increasingly desperate discomfort that prevents any real rest. Finally, reluctantly, you extract yourself from the warmth of the pallet and the cocoon of your wife's body heat. Standing in the absolute darkness is a strange experience. Even though you've done it countless times, your sense of balance shifts without visual reference points, and you have to rely entirely on proprioception and memory to navigate the familiar space. You know the chamber pot is in the corner, roughly 8 steps from the pallet, oriented at a specific angle to avoid the area where the goat sleeps. You move carefully, sliding your feet rather than lifting them, hands extended slightly to detect obstacles before you collide with them. The cold air hits you immediately. The cottage holds some warmth from the banked fire and the collective body heat of its occupants. But the difference between lying under covers and standing exposed is shocking. Your breath becomes visible, you know this even though you can't actually see it, feeling the moisture condense as you exhale. The floor is hard-packed earth, slightly damp, cold enough to make your bare feet ache within seconds. Medieval people lived in a state of near constant physical discomfort that would be intolerable to modern sensibilities, but which you've adapted to through sheer necessity. You reach the corner and find the chamber pot by touch, your hands confirming its location and orientation. The pot is heavy, definitely more than half full with the night's accumulated contributions from family members. You position yourself carefully and relieve yourself, trying to aim to minimize noise and splashing. Though in practice it's impossible to be truly quiet. The sound seems enormous in the stillness, amplified by the darkness and the silence and your heightened awareness. The smell from the chamber pot is overpowering this close, a concentrated ammonia stench that makes your eyes water, even though you can't see your own hand. This will absolutely need to be emptied first thing in the morning. It's reached the point where it's becoming genuinely unpleasant, even by medieval standards. You finish quickly, already planning tomorrow's disposal routine. Carry the pot outside before the sun is fully up. Dump the contents in the gutter. Rinse the pot at the village well if you can manage it without too many neighbours seeing and judging. Navigating back to the pallet is somehow more difficult than the outward journey. Despite covering the exact same ground, your sense of direction has become slightly confused in the darkness, and you find yourself drifting off course, nearly stumbling into the table before correcting. Your reaching hand brushes against something hanging from the wall, probably the rope coil you use for various farm tasks, and the unexpected contact makes you freeze momentarily. Heart rate spiking before your brain identifies the sensation as harmless. Finally, you reach the pallet and lower yourself back down, trying to minimize disturbance to your wife who has somehow remained asleep through your excursion. The straw rustles loudly as you settle, and you hold your breath waiting to see if you've woken anyone. But the breathing patterns around you remain unchanged. Your family and your animals all still deep in their own unconscious worlds, leaving you alone with your wakeful thoughts in the darkness. You pull the blanket back over yourself, a rough woolen thing that's more functional than comfortable. Heavy enough to provide warmth but scratchy against bare skin. Your wife's body heat has kept her side of the pallet warm, and you press close to her again, stealing that warmth, feeling the cold gradually recede from your feet and hands. The contrast between the cottage's cold air and the small warm pocket under the blanket is profound, a reminder of how much of medieval life revolved around the desperate pursuit and conservation of warmth. The darkness no longer feels quite so absolute. Your eyes have adapted further during your excursion, and now you can make out the very faintest suggestion of shapes, the darker darkness where the wall meets the ceiling, the slightly lighter darkness of the open space in the cottage's centre, the various darknesses that indicate the positions of table, chest, and hanging implements. It's not vision in any meaningful sense, more like visual imagination confirmed by memory and spatial awareness. Your mind turns to contemplation of time, that strange malleable substance that behaves so differently in darkness than in daylight. How long have you been awake during this particular interval, minutes, hours? There's no way to know without the sun's position or the watchman's call, and in this sensory deprivation, your internal sense of duration becomes unreliable. The experience creates a kind of temporal vertigo, a feeling of being unstuck from the normal flow of time, existing in an eternal present that might last forever or might end in the next instant. This, you realize, is what the quiet hour after sunset has evolved into by the deepest part of night, a state of enforced stillness so profound it becomes almost meditative. The initial quiet of evening, when the village first settled and people perform their bedtime rituals, has transformed into something deeper, more absolute. This is the quiet that exists at the bottom of night, where consciousness itself becomes uncertain, where the boundary between waking and sleeping grows permeable and strange. You feel yourself beginning to drift again, thoughts becoming less linear, more dreamlike. The darkness seems to be seeping into your mind, filling the spaces where focused thought usually resides, replacing intentional consciousness with something more primitive and less verbal. This is how sleep returns in the deepest night, not through relaxation or comfort, but through a kind of surrender to the darkness, an acceptance that this sensory void is where you exist now and might exist forever, until suddenly you don't exist at all, because you've crossed the invisible line from waking into true unconsciousness. Time passes in unmeasurable increments, the darkness so complete and unchanging that you exist in a kind of suspended animation between sleep and waking. Your body has achieved a state of profound rest even though your mind remains partially conscious, drifting through fragmentary thoughts and half-formed dreams that feel more real than the darkness surrounding you. This is the deepest part of the medieval night, the hours that stretch between midnight and the first hints of dawn, when the village achieves its most complete stillness and the world seems to hold its breath in anticipation of morning that feels impossibly distant. The watchman's call finally breaks the silence. 3 of the clock and God watches over us. His voice sounding thin and exhausted, stretched to breaking by hours of solitary vigil in the cold and dark. You recognize the voice as belonging to John the younger watchman, the one who took over from Geoffrey around midnight. John's enthusiasm for the job has clearly waned as his shift has worn on, and his call lacks the robust confidence of earlier hours. He sounds like what he is, a tired man counting down the time until he can surrender his duties and seek his own bed. The village barely stirs at the 3 o'clock call. A few dogs bark half-heartedly, more from habit than genuine alertness. Someone coughs in a nearby cottage, a wet hacking sound that suggests illness, probably the same cough that's been circulating through the village for weeks, passing from person to person in the close quarters where disease spreads with depressing efficiency. Medieval communities were petri dishes for contagion, and the winter months particularly so, when everyone huddled indoors breathing each other's air, sharing each other's germs, waiting for spring to arrive and disperse the concentrated humanity back into open fields. Historians still argue whether medieval people slept more soundly during these deepest night hours, or whether the cumulative discomforts cold, hunger, full bladders, hard sleeping surfaces, animal noise, pain from various untreated conditions prevented truly deep rest. The evidence suggests enormous individual variation. As with most aspects of human experience, some people probably achieved the kind of profound unconsciousness that modern sleep researchers would recognize as ideal. Others likely spent their nights in the shallow, interrupted sleep you're experiencing now, where consciousness never fully releases its grip. Here's a detail that illuminates the medieval relationship with night. The hours between midnight and dawn were considered the most spiritually dangerous time, when the barrier between the living world and the supernatural realm was thinnest. Demons were most active during these hours, prowling for souls to claim. The dead were most likely to walk, seeking either vengeance or peace depending on the circumstances of their deaths. Even malevolent human activities, witchcraft, cursing, dark magic were believed to be most effective when performed in these darkest hours, your mind, drifting in that liminal space between waking and sleeping, is susceptible to exactly the kind of supernatural fears that daylight and activity normally keep suppressed. That sound outside, just the wind, surely. Moving through the thatch, could it be something else? That shadow in the corner, just absence of light, nothing more. Why does it seem to have shape and presence your rational mind? The part that functions in daylight knows these fears are baseless. But your nighttime mind, the primitive part that evolved in a world full of genuine predators and dangers, isn't so easily convinced. The cottage makes one of its periodic settling sounds, a sharp crack from the roof beam contracting in the cold, and you flinch involuntarily before recognizing it as harmless. Medieval people lived in a constant state of low-level hypervigilance, their nervous systems never fully relaxing because genuine threats existed alongside imagined ones. A sound in the night might be nothing, or it might be your cottage beginning to collapse, or it might be thieves breaking in, or it might be something worse that doesn't have a natural explanation. Your wife shifts beside you, making a small distressed sound in her sleep. You reach out automatically, placing a hand on her shoulder in a gesture of comfort that's become reflexive over years of marriage. She quiets immediately, settling back into deeper sleep, while you remain awake, staring into the darkness, your hand still resting on her shoulder, feeling the rise and fall of her breathing. These small gestures of connection and comfort are among the few tender moments available in a life otherwise dominated by hard labour and survival necessity. The cold is becoming more pronounced as the night ages toward its coldest point that hour just before dawn, when temperatures drop to their minimum and the banked fire has burned down to nearly nothing. You can feel the cold air on your face, in your lungs with each breath, seeping through the woolen blanket to touch your skin beneath. Your feet, extending beyond the edge of the blanket, have gone from cold to numb, that particular ache that signals the first stages of genuine cold injury if not addressed. You pull your feet closer to your body, curling into a tighter ball, seeking whatever warmth is available. The position is uncomfortable, you'll wake with stiff joints and aching muscles, but it's better than letting the cold damage your extremities. Medieval people frequently suffered from frostbite during winter months, losing toes or fingers to cold that modern heating makes unimaginable. Even in autumn, these deep night hours can be dangerously cold for people whose cottages have minimal insulation and whose fires burn low to conserve fuel. One of your children, the middle daughter, you think, though in the darkness you can't be sure whimpers in her sleep, a sound that quickly escalates toward full crying. You hear your wife wake instantly, maternal instinct overriding exhaustion, moving in the darkness toward the child. The pallet rustles violently as she sits up, reaches across, finds the child by touch alone. Murmured words of comfort, too quiet for you to make out, gradually calm the crying back to whimpers and then to silence. The child it was indeed your middle daughter has settled back into sleep. Whatever dream or discomfort disturbed her now past or forgotten. Your wife returns to her position beside you but doesn't immediately fall back asleep. You can tell by her breathing that she is awake, lying in the darkness with her own thoughts, possibly doing her own calculations about how much night remains before the dawn will release you all from this enforced stillness. Medieval mothers never truly rested even in sleep. Part of their consciousness remained alert to children's needs, ready to wake instantly at the first sign of distress. The watchman makes another round. Though he doesn't call out the hour this time, perhaps he's forgotten in his exhaustion. Or perhaps he's decided the sleeping village doesn't need to be disturbed. You hear only his footsteps, still identifiable by their particular rhythm and the tap of his staff, passing by your cottage and continuing on his circuit. The sound is somehow lonely. This solitary figure trudging through the darkness while everyone else huddles in whatever warmth and comfort they can manage. You wonder what John the Watchman thinks about during these long hours of solitary patrol. Does he resent the duty, curse the necessity that drives him to accept such uncomfortable work? Does he find a kind of peace in the solitude, a rare opportunity for private thoughts away from the constant press of family and community? Does he tell himself stories, sing quiet songs, pray continuously to keep his mind occupied and his spirits up? You'll never know, because such questions aren't asked in your world where privacy of thought is assumed and introspection rarely discussed. The darkness is beginning to change in ways too subtle to see, but which your body somehow senses. It's not lighter, the sun is still hours below the horizon, but it feels different, less absolute, as though the darkness is beginning to anticipate its own ending. This is probably just your mind playing tricks, projecting your desperate desire for morning onto the unchanging reality of deep night. But medieval people claim to be able to sense the approach of dawn long before any visual evidence appeared, and perhaps there's something to that claim, some biological clock attuned to Earth's rotation in ways that modern humans have lost. Your thoughts turn to the day ahead, mentally reviewing the labour that awaits. The Lord's fields need attention, there's always work owed in service, always tasks that benefit him rather than you. Your own small plot needs tending as well, though finding time for your own farming between the Lord's demands and simple exhaustion is a perpetual challenge. The animals will need feeding and managing. The cottage requires constant maintenance that you never quite have time or resources to properly address. The list is endless, exhausting to contemplate, made worse by the physical tiredness that never fully leaves your body. But those are problems for daylight hours. Right now, in this deepest part of night, you exist in a strange limbo where the day's work is both impossibly distant and frighteningly close. Morning will come, it always does, and with it the return to labour and struggle and the thousand small indignities of peasant existence. But for now, for these remaining hours of darkness, you're suspended in this quiet space where even exhaustion and discomfort can't entirely destroy the strange peace of enforced stillness. The darkness is definitely changing now, though the change is so gradual it's almost imperceptible. You've been lying awake long enough that your eyes have achieved their maximum sensitivity, and you're beginning to detect the very first hints of what will eventually become dawn. It's not light, not yet. Not for a while still, but rather a subtle shift in the quality of darkness, a thinning of the absolute black into something marginally less absolute. The deepest part of night is finally releasing its grip. And though dawn remains distant, the village is beginning its slow, reluctant stirring toward wakefulness. The rooster is the first to sense the coming change. You hear him shift on his beam, his claws scratching against wood, his body rustling with that particular fussiness roosters display when preparing to crow. He's early, he's always early, apparently programmed to announce dawn before it actually arrives, as though worried it might not happen without his vocal assistance. Medieval people regulated their mornings by rooster crow more reliably than by any other timepiece. And your rooster takes his responsibility seriously, sometimes to the point of absurdity. The first crow, when it comes, is shockingly loud in the stillness. A sound designed by nature to carry across maximum distance and penetrate maximum walls, is a clarion call that says morning is approaching whether you're ready or not, that the quiet hours are ending, that the cycle of labour and survival is about to resume. Your children stir on their pallet, not quite waking but shifting from deep sleep toward lighter stages. The goat bleats softly in response to the rooster, adding her voice to the growing chorus of animal sounds that herald the approaching day. Historians still argue whether medieval people actually woke at first rooster crow or whether they, like modern people with alarm clocks, often ignored the initial signal and required multiple prompts before actually rising. The evidence suggests significant variation. Farmers with urgent fieldwork probably rose immediately, while others might have stolen a few more precious minutes of rest. You fall somewhere in between, acknowledging the rooster's announcement but not yet ready to fully surrender the night and face the day ahead. Your wife is definitely awake now. You can tell by the change in her breathing and the slight tension in her body. She's probably running through her own mental checklist of morning tasks, rekindling the fire, preparing something resembling breakfast, getting children dressed and ready, dealing with the animals, checking what food supplies remain and planning how to stretch them further. Medieval women's labour was unrelenting, a constant cycle of cooking, cleaning, childcare, and household management that began before dawn and continued until collapse into exhausted sleep. Here's a detail that modern people find shocking. The transition from night to working day was often shockingly abrupt by contemporary standards. There was no leisurely morning routine, no coffee and newspaper, no warm shower to ease into consciousness. You simply woke, rose from your pallet, and immediately began working, often without eating anything until several hours into the day. Breakfast as a substantial meal didn't exist for most medieval peasants. You broke your fast with perhaps some bread or leftover pottage from the previous night, eaten while already engaged in labour. The rooster crows again, joined this time by other roosters from neighbouring cottages. creating a cascade of crowing that ripples across the village. It's almost competitive, each rooster trying to outcrow the others, establishing dominance or territory, or simply expressing the mysterious inner drives that motivate roosters. The sound is both annoying and comforting annoying because it's impossibly loud and repetitive. Comforting because it's familiar and signals the return to normal rhythms after the strange suspension of deepest night. You become aware of sounds from other cottages' doors opening, people stepping outside to urinate or empty chamber pots before the village is fully awake and watching. The morning disposal of night phased follows a certain etiquette better to do it early while darkness still provides some cover. Avoiding the embarrassment of being observed dumping your family's accumulated excrement into the street. You know you should rise and deal with your own overflowing chamber pot, but the thought of leaving the pallet's relative warmth for the cottage's bitter cold air is almost unbearable. The darkness is definitely lighter now, transitioning from pure black toward deep grey. You can make out shapes in the cottage with increasing clarity, the table's silhouette, the chest against the wall, the hanging bundles of herbs and implements. The transition from absolute darkness to pre-dawn dimness is one of the most dramatic shifts in medieval daily life, more significant in some ways than full sunrise, because it marks the return of vision, the ability to navigate and function without relying purely on memory and touch. Your oldest son sits up on the children's pallet, rubbing his eyes, yawning so widely you can hear his jaw crack. He's at the age 10 years old where he's beginning to take on adult responsibilities, learning the skills he'll need to survive as a peasant farmer. This means earlier waking, harder work, less tolerance for childish complaints about exhaustion or cold or hunger. Medieval childhood was brief, ending around age 7 or 8 when children transitioned into serious labour. Your son is already deep into that transition, his body developing the wiry strength and endurance that farm work demands. The pig chooses this moment to announce his own waking with a series of grunts and snorts that escalate toward an actual squeal. He's hungry. He's always hungry, and he's making sure everyone knows it. You hear him heaving himself to his feet, his hooves clattering on the hard floor, his substantial bulk moving toward the door in anticipation of being let out. The pig has no patience for the gradual transition from night to day. He wants out, wants food, wants to begin his day of rooting and foraging and generally making a nuisance of himself. Your wife finally rises, the movement decisive and final, marking the official end of night and beginning of day for your household. You hear her feet hit the floor, hear her sharp intake of breath as the cold air hits her, hear her moving through the familiar morning routine with practiced efficiency. She's rekindling the fire first, always the first priority, because everything else depends on it. You hear the scrape of the poker against coals, the soft shower of ash as she uncovers the buried embers, the crackle as she adds kindling that catches and begins to burn. The growing firelight provides the first real illumination of the morning, painting the cottage interior in warm orange tones that chase away the grey dimness. You can see your wife's silhouette against the flames, bent over the hearth, coaxing the fire back to life with the skill of someone who's performed this task thousands of times. The fire's warmth is immediate and welcome, beginning to push back against the night's accumulated cold, creating a pocket of comfort that will gradually expand to fill the cottage. You force yourself to sit up, knowing that prolonging the transition will only make it harder. The cold air hits you like a physical blow, making you gasp, making you immediately regret leaving the pallet's warmth. But this is medieval life. Comfort is rare and brief. Discomfort is constant and enduring, and you simply push through because there's no alternative. Your feet find the floor, cold and slightly damp with condensation from all the breathing bodies and animals, and you stand, feeling your joints protest after a night of minimal movement on an unforgiving surface. The other children are waking now, the younger ones whining and complaining about the cold, the older ones rising with sullen acceptance of what the day will demand. Your 3-year-old daughter is crying, that particular morning cry of confusion and discomfort that young children produce when wrenched from sleep into harsh reality. Your wife moves to comfort her while simultaneously continuing to manage the fire. Medieval mothers were masters of multitasking, juggling multiple urgent demands with practiced efficiency born of necessity. You move to unbar the door, the wooden beam heavy in your hands, lifting it from its brackets and setting it aside. The door swings open onto pre-dawn dimness, revealing a village that's rapidly coming to life. Other doors are opening, other families emerging to begin their days, other chamber pots being emptied with splashes and the brief sharp smell of waste hitting the street. The air outside is cold but fresh, a relief after the cottage's concentrated odours of smoke and bodies and animals. The sky above is still dark but no longer black. It's transitioned to deep blue-grey, with the eastern horizon just beginning to show the faintest hint of colour that suggests the sun's eventual approach. Stars are still visible but fading, losing their brilliance as the sky gradually lightens. This is the liminal time between night and day, neither one nor the other, a transitional space that medieval people recognised as spiritually significant, a time when prayers were particularly potent. When the supernatural world was still accessible, but the natural world was also reasserting itself. You can see the watchman making his final round. John's figure barely visible in the dimness, moving with the exhausted shuffle of someone whose long shift is finally ending. He'll make his last circuit of the village, ensure everything is secure, then surrender his duties to daylight and seek his own bed while everyone else begins working. The night watch has kept its vigil successfully. The village survived another night without fire or invasion or supernatural disaster, and that alone is worth celebrating. Though celebration will take the form of simply moving forward into another day of labour, your wife hands you the chamber pot. It's your task to empty it, a job you've performed every morning for years. You carry it carefully toward the door, trying not to slosh the contents, preparing to add your family's contribution to the street's general filth. This morning ritual is degrading and unpleasant, but it's also so routine as to be unremarkable. Just another task in the endless cycle of tasks that define your existence. But before you step outside, you pause in the doorway, looking back at your cottage interior now illuminated by firelight, at your family beginning their day, at the familiar space that represents home despite its poverty and discomfort. The quiet hour after sunset has transformed into the stirring hour before sunrise, the village transitioning from the stillness of night into the motion of day. The cycle continues, as it always does, as it always will, the eternal rhythm of medieval life rolling forward regardless of individual comfort or preference or desire. The night is ending, the day is beginning, and you, like your ancestors before you and your descendants after you, will meet it with whatever strength and endurance you can muster, because that's what survival demands, and survival is all there is. The eastern sky is definitely lighter now, that deep transformation from blue-grey toward the warmer tones that promise actual sunrise, still perhaps an hour away, but coming, inevitable, as reliable as breathing. You stand in your doorway, chamber pot still in hand, watching the village fully wake around you, smoke beginning to rise from cottage chimneys as fires are rekindled. Children's voices carrying through the morning air, animals being released from overnight confinement to begin their own daily routines of feeding and foraging, The quiet hour after sunset has completed its cycle, transitioning through the various stages of night, the initial settling, the deep stillness, the strange wakeful intervals, and now this gentle stirring toward day. Each stage held its own character, its own challenges, its own small mercies. The darkness that seemed so absolute and potentially threatening has surrendered to approaching light without drama or fanfare, simply fading as light always fades when something stronger replaces it. You find yourself grateful, in a way that's difficult to articulate, for the night's passage, grateful that your family survived, intact, that the cottage didn't burn, that no disaster visited in the dark hours. These small survivals accumulate into a life, into a family line, into the continuation of everything you know and are. The medieval world asks so little of its peasants merely that they work until exhaustion, endure constant discomfort, accept their position without complaint, and somehow survive long enough to produce the next generation who will do the same. And yet, standing here in the pre-dawn stillness, you feel something that might almost be contentment. The night was long, but it's ending. The day will be hard, but you'll face it. Your family is warm, fed well enough, together. The simple fact of continuing existence feels, in this moment, like enough. The sun will rise soon. The quiet hour has passed. Sleep, sweet dreams, and may your own nights hold such peaceful rhythms